somewhere in the mist of the 5th century on an island at the edge of the known world, a letter was sent that would never be answered. The recipients were the consuls of Rome, Aetius specifically, the last great general of the Western Empire. The senders were the civic authorities of a province called Britannia, men who still thought of themselves as Romans, though they had not seen a legion in a generation. The letter, preserved in fragments by a monk named Gildas writing a century later, was a cry from the darkness. "The barbarians push us back to the sea," it read. "The sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered." The consuls did not reply. They could not. Aetius was fighting for the survival of Gaul itself, and Britannia, that rain-soaked, silver-veined, impossibly distant province at the empire's northwestern frontier, had already slipped from Rome's grasp. The letter, which historians call the Groans of the Britons, marks not a beginning but an ending. It is the last recorded appeal from Roman Britain to the imperial centre. After that, silence. After that, the dark. And somewhere in that darkness, in the chaos and blood and desperate improvisation of a collapsing civilization, a figure emerged. We do not know his face, we do not know his birth name with certainty, or the year he drew his first breath, or the hill where his bones finally came to rest. We know him only by the echo he left in the memory of a broken people, a war leader, a commander, a man who rode against the tide of history and held it back, if only for a moment. His name, in the tongue of his enemies, might have meant bear. In the language of later poets, it would come to mean something closer to hope. His name was Arthur, and this is the story of how a desperate historical necessity became the most enduring legend the Western world has ever told. To understand Arthur, you must first understand what was lost. Picture Britain in the year 400 of the Common Era. 4 centuries of Roman rule have transformed an island of warring Celtic tribes into something unprecedented. A province, integrated into the largest administrative system the ancient world had ever seen. Stone roads run in disciplined lines from Londinium to Eboracum, from the legionary fortress at Diva to the garrison walls at Saguntium overlooking the Irish Sea. In the towns, magistrates in togas adjudicate disputes according to written law. Bathhouses steam in the grey British air. Temples to Mithras and Jupiter stand alongside shrines to local deities who have learned to wear Roman faces. Children of tribal chieftains study Latin grammar and dream of senatorial careers in distant Rome. This is not occupation in the modern sense, this is assimilation. By the 4th century, many of the soldiers manning Hadrian's Wall are themselves British-born, worshipping British gods, married to British women, defending a British homeland that happens to be Roman. The distinction between conqueror and conquered has blurred into something more complex. A hybrid culture, Romano-British in its bones, where Celtic languages still echo in the countryside but Latin writes the laws, and Christian bishops are beginning to challenge the old Druids for spiritual authority. And then, with catastrophic speed, it all comes apart. The trouble does not begin in Britain. It begins 1,000 miles to the east, in the vast grasslands beyond the Danube, where a people called the Huns are moving westward with a violence that will reshape the map of Europe. Before the Huns flee the Goths, and before the Goths flee the Vandals, and all of them, Goths and Vandals and Burgundians and Franks, begin pressing against the frontiers of the Roman Empire with a desperation born of their own displacement. The great migrations have begun. The empire, already stretched thin by civil wars and economic collapse and a taxation system that crushes the peasantry, cannot hold. In the year 407, a man named Constantine, not the great emperor of that name, but a common soldier elevated by his troops in a moment of crisis, strips Britain of its remaining mobile forces and takes them across the Channel to Gaul. He is chasing a usurper's crown, hoping to carve out a realm of his own in the chaos. He will fail and die, and his army will never return. But Constantine cannot know this. From Britain's perspective, all that matters is that the soldiers are gone. The legions that have protected the province for 4 centuries, that have manned the walls and patrolled the roads and kept the sea wolves at bay, have marched away to fight someone else's war. They are not coming back. What follows is not a single catastrophic event, but a slow-motion collapse, the kind of dying that takes decades and looks, from inside, less like an ending than an endless series of small defeats. The year 408 brings particularly savage raids. Germanic warriors, the Romans call them Saxons, though they come from many tribes along the North Sea coast, land in increasing numbers along the eastern shores. They are not yet settlers. They are pirates, slavers, opportunists who have learned that the rich province across the water is no longer defended. They burn what they cannot carry and carry away what they can sell. Entire coastal communities are put to the sword. By 409, the situation has grown so desperate that something remarkable happens. The Britons, according to the Byzantine historian Zosimus, expel the Roman administration entirely. They throw out the imperial officials, reject the tax collectors, and attempt to organise their own defence. This is not rebellion in the usual sense, it is abandonment. Rome has failed them, and they will look to their own resources. The following year brings the famous rescript of Honorius. The Western Emperor, besieged in Ravenna while Visigothic armies march on Rome itself, sends a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defences. Scholars debate whether this was permission, abdication, or simply a harried bureaucrat acknowledging what was already fact. But the symbolic weight is unmistakable. After 367 years, Rome has officially let go. What does it mean in practical terms for a civilization to end? It means the tax collectors stop coming, which sounds like relief until you realise that the tax system paid for everything. The roads, the walls, the soldiers, the courts, the bureaucracy that turned disputes into lawsuits instead of blood feuds. Without taxes, there is no payment. Without payment, the army dissolves. Without the army, there is no one to enforce the law. Without law, the strong take from the weak, and the weak die or flee, or learn to become strong themselves. It means the towns begin to empty. Not all at once. Some Romano-British cities will cling to urban life for generations, but steadily, irreversibly. The bathhouses go cold, the forums fall silent. The sophisticated water systems that fed the great public fountains crack and clog and are forgotten. Within a century, Anglo-Saxon settlers will be building their wooden halls in the shadows of Roman ruins, half convinced that only giants could have raised such stones. It means the written word retreats. Literacy, in the Roman world, was an administrative necessity. Every soldier's pay, every merchant's contract, every legal judgment required documentation. Without the structures that demanded reading and writing, the skills atrophy. History becomes memory, and memory becomes story, and story becomes legend. This is why we know so little about what actually happened in 5th century Britain, because the people who lived through it largely stopped writing things down, and it means violence. Unceasing, endemic, chaotic violence. The Saxons pressing from the east, the Picts raiding from beyond the northern walls, Irish warbands striking the western coasts, and perhaps worst of all, the Britons themselves turning on each other, as local warlords and would-be kings scramble to fill the vacuum left by imperial collapse. The old tribal boundaries, suppressed but never quite forgotten, reassert themselves. A man with a warband can take what he wants, and there is no higher authority to stop him. This is the world that would produce Arthur. Not the gleaming towers of Camelot, but smoking ruins. Not chivalric jousts, but desperate last stands in muddy hill forts. Not a golden age, but a catastrophe. And within that catastrophe, a need so powerful it would echo through 1,000 years of storytelling. The need for a saviour. In times of collapse, people do not simply suffer, they also remember. And in the decades after 410, as Britain fragmented into warring kingdoms and the sea wolves pushed ever further inland, the Britons remembered that they had once been great. They remembered the roads and the walls and the eagles. They remembered order, and in that remembering they began to shape the raw material of a hero. The earliest historical text that describes this period comes from an unlikely source, a British monk named Gildas, writing around the year 540, perhaps a century after the events he describes. Gildas is not a historian in any modern sense. He is a prophet of doom, a thundering moralist who uses history as a weapon against the sinful kings of his own day. His work, titled De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, reads less like a chronicle than a Jeremiad, filled with biblical parallels and rhetorical fire. It is maddeningly vague on specifics. Gildas rarely names dates, seldom identifies places, and seems deliberately to obscure the details that a modern reader most wants to know. But Gildas does give us something crucial. He gives us the shape of the resistance. According to Gildas, after the initial disasters of the early 5th century, the Britons rallied under a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. This Ambrosius was, Gildas tells us, a man of Roman descent. His parents had worn the purple, suggesting a family of imperial officials or perhaps even distant connection to the emperors themselves. Under Ambrosius, the Britons began to fight back. Victories alternated with defeats, but the tide of Saxon conquest was stemmed. And then, at a place called Mons Badonicus, Mount Baden, the Britons won a decisive battle that brought peace to the island for a generation. Gildas's account is precious but frustrating. He does not date the Battle of Baden precisely, though scholars have placed it somewhere between 490 and 516 CE, based on internal chronological clues. He does not name the British commander at Baden, a silence that has spawned endless speculation. Was it Ambrosius himself, grown old but still fighting? Was it a successor, a younger war leader who had risen to prominence in Ambrosius's shadow? Was it perhaps the man who would come to be called Arthur? Gildas does not say, and this silence is itself significant, because when a later author, writing 3 centuries after Gildas, finally attached a name to the victory at Baden, he would do so in a way that established Arthur's place in history forever, while simultaneously ensuring that we could never be certain whether Arthur was real. The Historia Brittonum emerges from 9th century Wales like a lantern held up in a darkened room. It does not illuminate everything, but it shows us the shape of the shadows. The text is traditionally attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, though modern scholars are less certain of the authorship. What we know is that it was compiled around the year 828 in the Kingdom of Gwynedd, during a period when Welsh Christians were attempting to preserve and systematise the fragmentary traditions of their ancestors. The Historia Brittonum is less a history than a scrapbook, a collection of genealogies, origin legends, miracle stories and battle lists, assembled from earlier sources now lost to us. Some of these sources were clearly oral traditions, poems and tales that had been passed down through generations of bards. Others may have been written documents from the sub-Roman period, precious manuscripts that the compiler had access to, but that would not survive the Viking raids and monastic fires of later centuries. And buried within this heterogeneous collection is a passage that would change the shape of Western literature. Then, Nennius writes, describing the wars against the Saxons, Arthur fought against them in those days, together with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was the leader of battles. The Latin phrase is dux bellorum, leader of battles, or more loosely, war commander. It is a military title, not a royal one. Arthur, in this earliest surviving reference, is not a king. He is a general, a professional soldier, the man who coordinates the armies of the British kings and leads them personally into combat. This distinction between the war leader and the crowned sovereign will prove crucial for understanding how the legend evolved. The Arthur of Nennius is a servant of kings, not their equal. He is defined by his sword arm, not his bloodline, and what a sword arm it was. Nennius provides a battle list, 12 engagements in which Arthur led the Britons to victory. The first battle was at the mouth of the river called Glyne. The second and third and fourth and fifth were upon another river, which is called Dubglas, in the region of Linuis. The sixth battle was upon the river which is called Bassus. The seventh battle was in the forest of Celidon, that is, Catcoit Celidon. The eighth battle was at the fortress of Ginion, in which Arthur carried the image of the Holy Virgin Mary on his shoulders, and the pagans were put to flight on that day, and there was a great slaughter of them through the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, and through the power of the Blessed Virgin Mary his mother. The ninth battle was waged in the city of the Legion. The 10th battle was fought on the shore of the river called Tribrute. The 11th battle was fought on the mountain called Agned. The 12th battle was on Mount Baden, in which 960 men fell in one day from a single charge by Arthur, and no one laid them low save he alone, and in all the battles he emerged as victor. Read this passage carefully, because it contains both everything and nothing. Everything, because it establishes the template that every subsequent Arthurian narrative would follow. Arthur as the central figure in a series of decisive battles. Arthur as the champion of Christian Britain against pagan invaders. Arthur as the man who achieves what ought to be impossible. The image of the Virgin on his shoulders, the hundreds slain in a single charge, the unbroken string of victories. This is not history, not in any modern sense. This is legend crystallizing into form. This is the moment when a dimly remembered war leader begins his transformation into myth, and nothing, because almost every specific detail dissolves under examination. Where is the River Glyne? Scholars have proposed the River Glen in Lincolnshire, or the River Glen in Northumberland, or other rivers entirely. The 4 battles on the Dubglais in Linui have been located everywhere from the Scottish borders to the Midlands. Cat Coit Celadon, the Battle of the Celadon Forest, refers to the Great Caledonian Wood of southern Scotland. But was Arthur truly fighting so far north? The city of the Legion could be Chester, or Caerleon in Wales, or York. Mount Baden itself, the climactic victory, has been placed at Bath, at Badbury Rings in Dorset, at a dozen other sites across southern Britain. The truth is that we cannot map these battles with any confidence. The place names are garbled, perhaps deliberately obscured, perhaps simply corrupted through centuries of transmission. The original battles, if they occurred, may have been scattered across generations and different commanders, only later gathered and attributed to a single heroic figure. The 12 battle structure itself has a suspicious neatness to it. 12, after all, is a number of completion in biblical numerology, echoing the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. And yet the pattern that Nennius records corresponds to something real. Archaeology confirms that the Saxon advance was halted in the late 5th or early 6th century. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would eventually dominate England did not achieve that dominance smoothly or quickly. There were generations of resistance, periods of British resurgence, a long grinding war that lasted the better part of a century. Someone led that resistance. Someone coordinated the British forces. Someone won at least some of the victories that bought the Britons time. Was it Arthur? The honest answer is that we cannot know, but we can say this. By the 9th century, when Nennius compiled his sources, the Britons had been telling stories about Arthur for a very long time. The Dux Bellorum was not Nennius's invention. He inherited the figure from a tradition that stretched back through the oral culture of the Welsh bards to the smoke-filled mead halls of the sub-Roman warlords themselves. Arthur came to Nennius already clothed in legend. The monk's contribution was to commit that legend to Latin prose, to give it the appearance of history, and to ensure that it would survive the destruction of the earlier sources. The 12 battles are a monument built from uncertainty, but what they commemorate, the memory of resistance, the dream of a leader who could unite a fractured people and hold back the darkness, that is as real as anything in history. But Nennius is not the only path into the oldest Arthur. Before the monks wrote their chronicles, before Latin prose fixed the legend into pseudo-historical form, there were the bards, and the bards remembered differently. The Welsh poetic tradition stretches back into an antiquity we can only dimly perceive. These were not writers in the sense that we understand the term. They were oral performers, professional rememberers, whose function in Celtic society was to preserve the genealogies, the legal traditions, the heroic deeds of the ruling houses that employed them. Their poems were composed according to strict metrical rules designed not for beauty alone but for memorization. The complex patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme that characterize Welsh bardic verse and mnemonic technologies, ways of ensuring that important information survives the death of its carriers. The oldest Welsh poem that mentions Arthur is also perhaps the most tantalizing. It is called Y Gododin, and it preserves the memory of a catastrophic defeat. The manuscript itself is late. The Book of Aneurin dates to the 13th century, but the poem it contains is far older. Scholars have debated its dating intensely, but a consensus has emerged that the core of Y Gododin was composed in the late 6th or early 7th century, within living memory of the events it describes. Those events were grim. A warband of 300 British warriors, gathered from the kingdom of Gododin in what is now southeastern Scotland, rode south to attack the Anglian stronghold at Cattraeth. They failed. They died, almost to a man, in a doomed last stand against overwhelming odds. The poem is an elegy, a mourning song, a catalogue of heroes who will never ride home. And in one stanza, perhaps original, perhaps added later, impossible to determine, the poet praises a warrior named Gwardur who slaughtered his enemies with ferocious skill. He glutted black ravens on the rampart of the fort, the verse proclaims, though he was no Arthur. He was no Arthur. The phrase is comparison, not narrative. The poet assumes his audience already knows who Arthur is, already understands what it means to measure a warrior against the greatest hero of the age. Arthur is invoked not as a character in the poem's story, but as a standard of martial excellence, the ultimate fighter, the man against whom all others must be judged. And this invocation appears in a poem that may date to within a century of the historical figure's lifetime. What does this tell us? It tells us that Arthur was already legendary by the late 6th century. It tells us that his fame had spread beyond whatever local region he originally operated in, reaching poets in distant Gododin. It tells us that the mythologization of Arthur began almost immediately, that the man, if he existed, was transformed into symbol within decades of his death. We are not dealing with a gradual accumulation of legend over many centuries. We are dealing with an explosive crystallization of heroic myth around a figure who must have been, at some level, extraordinary. The bards preserved other early references to Arthur, scattered through poems and triads that survived the wreckage of the medieval period. The triads of the island of Britain, prose catalogues of British tradition that group figures and events into threes, mention Arthur repeatedly as the head of various courts, the leader of various expeditions, the principal hero of the age. The poem called Pargur, preserved in a manuscript from around 1275 but certainly based on much older material, presents Arthur in conversation with a porter who challenges him at a gate. Arthur must name his warriors and their deeds to gain entry, and the resulting catalogue gives us a glimpse of his warband as the early Welsh tradition imagined it. And who rides with Arthur in these oldest sources? Not Lancelot, that French interloper has not yet been invented. Not Percival or Galahad, creatures of the 12th century Romance explosion. The names that appear in Pargur are stranger, wilder, more deeply rooted in the Celtic mythological imagination. There is Che, whom later tradition would transform into the bumbling seneschal Kay, but who appears here as a deadly warrior of preternatural endurance, a man who could hold his breath for 9 days underwater, who could grow tall as a tree in battle. There is Bedwyr, the prototype of Bedivere, Arthur's most faithful companion, one-handed but invincible. There is Mabon, son of Modron, a figure drawn directly from pre-Christian Celtic mythology. Mabon, the divine youth, the eternal sun. These are not the knights of Camelot. These are figures from an older world, a world where the boundaries between human and divine have not yet hardened, where heroes consort with giants and hunt supernatural boars across the landscapes of an enchanted Britain. The Arthur of the Welsh bards is not a king in a stone castle dispensing chivalric justice. He is a warband leader in a magical wilderness, riding out against monsters. The proof of this earlier stratum lies in the tales that would eventually be collected under the title of the Mabinogion. The name itself is modern. The tales were grouped and translated by Lady Charlotte Guest in the 19th century, who took the title from a medieval Welsh term for apprentice bards. But the stories themselves are ancient, drawing on oral traditions that may reach back to the Iron Age, even as they incorporate elements from the historical sub-Roman period and the later medieval world. The manuscripts that preserve these tales date to the 14th century, the White Book of Riddoch, written around 1350, and the Red Book of Hergest, compiled between 1382 and 1410. But the stories they contain are older than the manuscripts. Scholars generally date their composition to the 11th and 12th centuries, with some elements reaching back considerably further. We are dealing, in other words, with a palimpsest, layers of tradition deposited over centuries, where a 6th century war leader rubs shoulders with characters from pre-Christian Celtic myth, and both are dressed in the narrative conventions of medieval Welsh storytelling. 3 of the Mabinogion tales feature Arthur prominently: Culhwch and Olwen, the Dream of Rhonabwy, and a trio of later romances that show clear French influence. Of these, Culhwch and Olwen is the most revealing, because it is the least touched by continental chivalric fashion. Here Arthur is not a courtly king, but a lord of wonders, surrounded by warriors whose abilities shade into the supernatural. The story recounts the quest of Culhwch, Arthur's cousin, to win the hand of Olwen, daughter of the giant Ysbaddaden. But to claim his bride, Culhwch must accomplish a series of impossible tasks set by the giant, tasks that require Arthur and his warband to range across Britain and into the otherworld itself. The central set piece of Culhwch and Olwen is the hunt for Twrch Trwyth, a monstrous boar who was once a king transformed by God as punishment for his sins. Between the boar's ears are the comb and shears that Culhwch must retrieve, and so Arthur gathers the greatest hunters of Britain, human, canine and otherwise, and pursues the beast across the Irish Sea, through the mountains of Wales, and down into Cornwall. It is a wild hunt in the mythological sense, a pursuit that stretches the boundaries of the natural world, featuring warriors who can run atop the tips of reeds, who can speak the languages of beasts, who can transform their shape at will, This is the pre-chivalric Arthur, the folk Arthur, the figure who existed before French poets dressed him in silk and placed him in a castle. He's a lord of liminal spaces, a commander at the border between the human and the more than human. His court is populated by men who are half god and half monster, and his adventures carry him into realms where geography and physics obey different rules. The religious layer is thin, Christianity appears, but it has not yet fully absorbed the older magic. The Bortuach Traeth was a king whom God punished, but the hunt itself could have come from any Celtic myth cycle. Understanding this stratum of the legend matters because it reveals what the Arthur story originally was. Before the Round Table, before the Grail quest, before the love triangle that would bring the kingdom down, Arthur was this: a war leader and a wonder worker, a commander of extraordinary men against extraordinary threats. The folk tradition did not give him a kingdom to rule. It gave him a war band to lead and a wilderness to ride through. The politics would come later. The tragedy would come later. In the beginning, there was only the bright company riding out, and the monsters falling before them. So we come to the moment of transformation, the 9th century, when a Welsh monk wrote down a list of battles, the 11th and 12th centuries, when other Welsh storytellers committed the old tales to manuscript. But something else was stirring. Across the Channel, in the courts of Norman England and Angevin France, a new fashion was emerging, a hunger for ancient heroes, for legendary kings, for stories that could justify the present by glorifying the past. And one man, more than any other, would answer that hunger. He would take the scattered traditions of the Welsh bards, the pseudo-history of Nennius, the fragmentary references in Gildas, and weave them into something unprecedented, a full biography of Arthur, from miraculous conception to mysterious death. He would invent Merlin, he would build Camelot, he would create the template for every Arthurian story that followed, from the Round Table romances to the Broadway musicals. His name was Geoffrey of Monmouth, and his book, the Historia Regum Britannia, would make Arthur immortal, while simultaneously making it impossible ever to know the truth. But that transformation belongs to the next chapter of our story. For now we remain in the twilight of the oldest sources, in the world of the bards and the battle lists, where a dux bellorum rides through the mist and a people remember what it meant to stand against the darkness. The Arthur of history, if he existed, was a Roman-British warlord fighting to preserve the remnants of civilization against the tide of the Anglo-Saxon settlement. The Arthur of the Welsh tradition was something more and less, a hero of the liminal spaces, a commander of wonders, a figure already halfway to myth. What made him unforgettable? Perhaps it was Baden, a victory so decisive that it bought Britain a generation of peace, a victory attributed to a single man whose name the bards would not let die. Perhaps it was the manner of his end, which even the earlier sources hint was clouded in mystery and violence, a death that was not quite a death, a king who might return. Or perhaps it was simply the need, the desperate, unquenchable need of a broken people for a champion who could make them whole again. The legions had left, the cities were burning, the Saxons were coming from the east, and the Picts from the north, and the Irish from the west, and the old world was dying in fire and blood. In that darkness, the Britons did what all peoples do in their darkest hours. They told stories, they remembered, they imagined a man who could save them, and in imagining him, they created something that would outlast their kingdoms, outlast their language, outlast even the memory of what they had been. They created Arthur, and Arthur, once created, refused to die. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a man of ambition, and his ambition found its perfect instrument in the past. He was, by his own account, a Welsh cleric, though of Monmouth suggests the borderlands, that liminal territory where Wales met England, where Celtic and Norman cultures rubbed against each other in uneasy proximity. He appears in the historical record as a canon of the Collegiate Church of St. George in Oxford, and later as Bishop-elect of St. Asaph, though there is little evidence he ever set foot in that troubled Welsh diocese. He moved in learned circles, knew the right people, dedicated his works to powerful patrons. He was, in short, a man who understood how knowledge could be turned to advantage, and how the right kind of story told with sufficient conviction could make a career. The England in which Geoffrey wrote was a kingdom at war with itself. Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, had died in 1135, and his death had triggered a succession crisis that would tear the realm apart for nearly 2 decades. Henry had designated his daughter Matilda as his heir, but the English barons had other ideas. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne, and what followed was a brutal civil war that the chroniclers would call the Anarchy, a time when, as one contemporary put it, Christ and his saints slept. In such times, men looked to the past for reassurance. They sought precedents, legitimacies, proofs that order had existed before and could exist again, and Geoffrey of Monmouth gave them something better than precedent. He gave them a golden age. The Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, was completed sometime before 1139, when Henry of Huntingdon, another chronicler, discovered a copy at the Norman Abbey of Bec and wrote of it with astonishment. The book purported to be a comprehensive history of Britain from its founding by Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas of Troy, down to the 7th century and the final Saxon triumph. It was written in elegant Latin prose, the language of scholarship and authority, and it was, to put the matter plainly, almost entirely invented. Not that Geoffrey admitted this. He claimed, with an air of wounded innocence that later critics would find maddening, that his work was simply a translation. Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, had given him a certain very ancient book written in the British language, that is, in Welsh or Breton, which set forth the acts of all the kings of Britain in continuous narrative. Geoffrey had merely rendered this precious source into Latin for the benefit of those who could not read the original. No such book has ever been found. No other writer mentions it. Scholars have searched for centuries, and the consensus is overwhelming. Walter's ancient British book never existed. It was a fiction, a scholarly alibi, a way of deflecting criticism by pointing to a source that conveniently could not be verified. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in other words, lied about his sources, and in lying created a masterpiece, for the Historia was a masterpiece of its kind. It was not history as we understand the term. It was something more dangerous and more enduring, a national mythology dressed in the clothes of scholarship. Geoffrey took the fragmentary traditions of the Welsh, the battle lists, the genealogies, the scattered references to Ambrosius and Arthur, and the struggle against the Saxons, and he expanded them, elaborated them, transmuted them into something grander and stranger than anything his sources had imagined. He gave Britain a Trojan origin, linking the island to the classical world that medieval readers revered. He populated the centuries with a dynasty of kings, some drawn from genuine tradition, others apparently invented from whole cloth. He created set-piece battles, elaborate speeches, dramatic confrontations, and at the centre of his narrative, occupying nearly a fifth of the entire work, he placed Arthur. The Arthur of Geoffrey's Historia is not the Dux Bellorum of Nennius, the war leader glimpsed through a list of battles. He is not the wonder worker of the Mabinogion, hunting supernatural boars across an enchanted landscape. He is something new, a king in the high medieval sense, a monarch of European stature, a conqueror whose achievements rival those of Alexander or Caesar. Geoffrey's Arthur defeats not only the Saxons but the Picts, the Scots, the Irish. He subdues Norway and Denmark. He invades Gaul and defeats the Roman tribune Frollo in single combat before the walls of Paris. And then, in the crowning act of his career, he receives an embassy from Rome itself, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, a rival, a challenger to Roman supremacy over the world. The audacity of this conception cannot be overstated. Geoffrey was writing for Norman patrons, men who traced their own legitimacy back to Rome, who saw themselves as heirs to the imperial tradition. And he gave them an Arthur who had humbled Rome, who had marched his British armies across the Alps, who had been on the verge of seizing the imperial throne itself before treachery called him home. It was an act of imaginative revenge on behalf of a conquered people, the Welsh, the descendants of the Britons, subjugated now by the very Normans to whom Geoffrey dedicated his book. And the Normans loved it. They loved it because it flattered them even as it celebrated their subjects. If the Britons had once produced a king who challenged Rome, then the island the Normans now ruled was no barbarous backwater, but a land of ancient glory, worthy of its new masters. Geoffrey understood the politics of mythology. He knew that a conquered people's heroes could be appropriated, that British glory could become English glory, could become Norman glory, each layer of conquest adding to rather than diminishing the prestige of the past. His Arthur belonged to everyone who claimed Britain as their own. The book spread with astonishing speed. Within a generation, over 200 manuscripts were in circulation, a number that testifies to an almost unprecedented demand. For comparison, most medieval texts survive in a handful of copies, The Historia exists in more than 220. It was read in England, in France, in Italy, in the German lands. It was translated into Welsh, ironically enough, as if the supposed source material were being returned to its native tongue. It was adapted into French verse by a Norman poet named Wace, whose Romano-British added new elements, including the first mention of the Round Table, that would become canonical. It was in short a literary phenomenon, the bestseller of the 12th century, and it created Arthur as we know him. Before Geoffrey, Arthur was a figure of Welsh tradition, celebrated by bards, invoked in a passing by chroniclers, but essentially provincial, a hero of a defeated people, unknown to the wider European world. After Geoffrey, Arthur was an international celebrity. His story became part of the cultural inheritance of Western Christendom, a reference point for kings and poets and ordinary people who would never read a word of Latin. The Historia did not merely preserve the Arthurian legend, it transformed it, amplified it, exported it beyond the borders of the Celtic world into the mainstream of medieval imagination. Yet the very success of Geoffrey's invention created a problem that has haunted Arthurian studies ever since. By clothing Arthur in the garments of pseudo-history, by presenting myth as chronicle and legend as fact, Geoffrey made it almost impossible to distinguish what might be true from what he had created. Later writers, lacking access to his sources that did not exist, had no way to verify or correct his account. They could only repeat it, embellish it, build upon it. The Historia became the foundation of all subsequent Arthurian literature, which meant that all subsequent Arthurian literature was built on a foundation of deliberate fiction. This was Geoffrey's gift and Geoffrey's curse to posterity. He made Arthur immortal. He also made Arthur unknowable. The shadowy warlord who might have fought at Baden was buried forever beneath the glittering king who conquered Rome, and no amount of historical excavation has ever been able to dig him out. But we must not move too quickly through Geoffrey's narrative, for it contains the seeds of everything that would follow, and one of those seeds, perhaps the most consequential of all, was Merlin. Merlin did not exist before Geoffrey of Monmouth, or rather, the figure we call Merlin, the wizard, the prophet, the architect of Arthur's destiny, was Geoffrey's creation, assembled from fragments and transformed into something wholly new. The raw materials were there, scattered across the traditions Geoffrey knew or claimed to know. In Welsh poetry and legend there was Myrddin Wyllt, Myrddin the Wild, a bard of the 6th century who was said to have gone mad after the Battle of Arthurian, fled into the forests of the north and lived there for decades as a wild man, gifted with prophetic sight but cut off from human society. The sources that preserve this tradition are later than Geoffrey, but the tradition itself may be older. Myrddin appears in poetry that claims descent from the age of the great battles, and his story has the ring of archaic myth, the seer who pays for his visions with his sanity, the wise man who can only speak truth when he has lost everything else. But Myrddin Wyllt was not connected to Arthur in the earliest traditions. He belonged to the north, to the old British kingdoms of what is now southern Scotland, and his madness was triggered not by any event in Arthur's story, but by the carnage of a battle fought between rival British kings long after Arthur's time. He was a figure of pathos and prophecy, but he was not a wizard in the sense that later literature would use the term. He did not work magic, he did not shape events, he merely foresaw them and wept. Geoffrey took this tradition and fused it with another. In Nennius's Historia Brittonum there is a story about the British king Vortigern, the villain of the Saxon settlement, the man who invited the wolves into the fold. Vortigern, says Nennius, attempted to build a fortress, but the walls kept collapsing. His wizards told him that the foundations must be sprinkled with the blood of a boy born without a father. Such a boy was found, Ambrosius, called Emrys in Welsh, but instead of dying, the boy revealed the true cause of the collapse: 2 dragons, one red and one white, sleeping beneath the site whose battles shook the earth. The boy prophesied the future of Britain, foretelling the triumph of the red dragon over the white, the Britons over the Saxons, and Vortigern, awed, gave up his fortress and his plans. In Nennius, this boy is called Ambrosius, and he is implicitly connected to Ambrosius Aurelianus, the Romano-British leader who rallied resistance against the Saxons. But Geoffrey saw other possibilities. He took the fatherless boy, the prophet of dragons, and he merged him with Myrddin the Wild. He changed the name, perhaps because Myrddin Latinized too easily into Myrddinus, uncomfortably close to a vulgar word, and created Merlin, and then he gave Merlin a story that would define the character forever. In Geoffrey's account, Merlin is discovered as a youth, the son of a mortal woman and an incubus, a demon of the night. This supernatural parentage explains his powers, his ability to see the future, to change his shape, to move the great stones of Stonehenge across the sea from Ireland through art incomprehensible to ordinary men. Merlin is not merely wise, he is uncanny, a creature of the boundaries between human and otherworldly, Christian and pagan, nature and civilization. He speaks in riddles. He appears and disappears without warning. He serves the British kings, but on his own terms, for his own purposes, which are never entirely clear. It was Geoffrey who first connected Merlin to Arthur's conception. The story would become one of the most famous in the entire legend, how Uther Pendragon, King of Britain, conceived a desperate passion for Igraine, wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, how Gorlois locked his wife away in the impregnable fortress of Tintagel, built on a rocky promontory accessible only by a narrow causeway, how Uther, maddened with desire, turned to Merlin for help, and how Merlin, through his arts, transformed Uther into the exact likeness of Gorlois, allowing the king to enter Tintagel and lie with Igraine while her husband was away at war. That night, Arthur was conceived, and that same night Gorlois was killed in battle, making the deception unnecessary but also impossible to undo. Uther married Igraine, legitimizing the child, but the shadow of that fraudulent conception would hang over Arthur's birth forever. The scene at Tintagel is pure Geoffrey. There is no trace of it in earlier sources. Nennius does not mention Uther or Igraine or any story of Arthur's birth. The Welsh traditions are silent on the matter. Geoffrey created the entire episode, drawing perhaps on folklore motifs of shape-shifting and royal seduction, perhaps on classical tales of Zeus transforming himself to seduce mortal women. But whatever his sources, the effect was transformative. Arthur was no longer simply a war leader who appeared from nowhere to fight the Saxons. He had an origin story, and that origin was marked by deception, desire, and magic. A dark beginning for a golden king. Merlin, having arranged Arthur's conception, fades from Geoffrey's narrative for a time. The Historia gives him other adventures, the transportation of the giant's dance from Ireland, prophecies uttered at Vortigern's court, cryptic visions of Britain's future, but his role in Arthur's life after birth is curiously limited. Later writers would expand Merlin's part enormously, making him Arthur's tutor, his counsellor, the architect of Camelot and the Round Table. But in Geoffrey, Merlin is more prophet than wizard, more oracle than advisor. His prophecies indeed became so famous that Geoffrey released them separately as the Prophetia Merlini, and they were read with intense seriousness for centuries, applied to contemporary events by readers who believed they contained genuine glimpses of the future. Around 1150, more than a decade after completing the Historia, Geoffrey returned to his creation with the Vita Merlini, the life of Merlin. This poem of over 1,500 hexameter lines presents a different Merlin than the Historia had shown, older, sadder, closer to the Welsh Myrddin Wilt from whom he'd been derived. The Vita's Merlin has gone mad after witnessing the slaughter of his kinsmen in battle. He has fled to the forests of Caledon, where he lives among the wild animals, enduring the harsh winters, refusing to return to human society. He is a king who has abandoned his kingdom, a prophet whose gift has become a curse. The Vita is a haunted, melancholy work, and it reveals something important about Geoffrey's imagination, that he understood the cost of supernatural knowledge, the loneliness of those who see too much. What did Merlin represent? The question admits of many answers, and perhaps that multiplicity of meaning is precisely the point. He was a druid figure, certainly, the last of the druids, perhaps, that Celtic intellectual elite who had served as prophets and poets and keepers of sacred knowledge before the Romans came. His woodland exile, his communion with animals, his mastery of natural forces all evoke the druidic connection to the wild places and the old powers. He was a link to the pagan past, a reminder that the Christian kingdoms of Britain were built on older foundations, that beneath the cathedrals and the crosses there were still stones that remembered other gods. But Merlin was also, in Geoffrey's hands, something more unsettling. He was the son of a demon. His powers came from a source that Christian theology could only view with suspicion. Every time Merlin worked his wonders, the question hovered unspoken. Whose side was he really on? His prophecies served British interests, but prophecy itself was a dangerous gift, associated in the Bible with both divine inspiration and demonic possession. The medieval church had no comfortable category for a figure like Merlin. He was useful, his powers helped the right people win, but he was also troubling, a reminder that not all knowledge comes from God, that there are powers in the world older and stranger than the Christian dispensation. This ambiguity would prove essential to Merlin's enduring appeal. He could be played as a wise counsellor, a benevolent guide, a grandfather figure dispensing wisdom to the young king. Or he could be played as something darker, a manipulator, a schemer, a man whose plans extended beyond human understanding and served purposes no mortal could fully grasp. Later romancers would have him fall victim to his own magic, trapped forever by a woman he loved and taught too well. But even in Geoffrey's original conception, there was something irreducibly strange about Merlin, something that resisted assimilation into comfortable Christian categories. He was necessary, that was the thing. Every subsequent retelling of the Arthurian legend has needed Merlin, or a figure like him. Someone must arrange Arthur's birth, someone must reveal his true identity, someone must guide the young king through the early perils of his reign. The story, as Geoffrey constructed it, required a supernatural helper, a figure who could bridge the gap between the ordinary world and the world of wonders. Without Merlin, Arthur would be just another king. With him, Arthur became the chosen one, the promised deliverer, the king whose coming was foretold and whose reign was fated. But fate, in the Arthurian universe, was always double-edged. Merlin saw the future, all of it, including the end. He knew, even as he arranged Arthur's conception, how the story would conclude. The treachery of Mordred, the ruin of the kingdom, the last battle at Camelot. He served Arthur anyway. He built the kingdom knowing it would fall. What kind of prophet does that? What kind of wisdom accepts tragedy as the price of glory? Perhaps that is Merlin's deepest meaning. He represents the human condition itself, the knowledge that all things end, coupled with the determination to build anyway. He stands at the hinge between the pagan world and the Christian kingdom, between fate and free will, between the darkness of the past and the uncertain light of the future. He makes the story possible, he makes the story tragic, and when his part is played, he vanishes into the forest, into the cave, into the enchantment from which he will never return, leaving Arthur to face the consequences of choices that were never entirely his own. Geoffrey of Monmouth understood something profound about mythology, that the most powerful figures are those who operate at the margins, who belong fully to no single world. Merlin was his most original creation, and also his most enduring. 1,000 years later, we are still telling stories about the wizard in the woods, the prophet who saw too much, the old man who taught a young king how to rule, and then disappeared before the kingdom fell. Geoffrey invented him. But he invented him out of something real, the memory of those who stood between worlds, who spoke for powers older than empires, who knew that all golden ages end and loved them anyway. The 12th century received Geoffrey's Historia with an enthusiasm that bordered on credulity. But not everyone was convinced. Almost immediately, voices of skepticism arose, churchmen and scholars who found Geoffrey's claims too extraordinary to accept. William of Newburgh, writing in the 1190s, subjected the Historia to withering criticism. He called Geoffrey's work the laughable figments of a man who has no shame about inventing lies. He pointed out the absurdity of Arthur conquering Rome, the impossibility of the grand battles Geoffrey described, the suspicious absence of any corroboration in earlier and more reliable sources. William was a historian in something approaching the modern sense. He cared about evidence, about plausibility, about distinguishing fact from fiction. And he recognised the Historia for what it was, not history but romance, dressed in scholarly robes it had no right to wear. But William's critique, however justified, failed to check the tide. The Historia had already escaped into the wider culture, and no amount of scholarly doubt could call it back. What Geoffrey had created was simply too attractive, too useful, too entertaining to be abandoned. His Arthur answered needs that mere history could never satisfy. He offered a British past that could stand comparison with Rome, a native hero who belonged to the island itself rather than to any of its conquerors. He provided a template for kingship, the just ruler, the warrior of God, the defender of his people against all enemies that real kings could aspire to emulate. He gave the courts of medieval Europe a legendary world in which to set their own dreams of chivalry and love. The consequences of Geoffrey's success were immediate and far-reaching. Within 20 years of the Historia's completion, the Norman poet Wace had translated and expanded the work into French verse. Wace's Roman de Brut, finished around 1155 and dedicated to Eleanor of Aquitaine, added elements that Geoffrey had not mentioned, most importantly the Round Table, that great symbol of equality and fellowship that would become inseparable from the Arthurian legend. Wace wrote for a courtly audience, and he understood what that audience wanted. Not chronicles but romances, not history but adventure, not facts but dreams. From Wace, the tradition passed to Chrétien de Troyes, and from Chrétien to the German poets, and the English romancers, and the vast prose cycles that would elaborate the legend through the 13th century and beyond. Each new writer added new elements: the Grail quest, the love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the tragedy of Tristan and Isolde, the adventures of individual knights who rode out from Camelot in search of glory. The Historia became the foundation, but the building that rose upon it was grander than anything Geoffrey had imagined, or perhaps exactly what he had imagined, the seed growing into the tree, the spark becoming the fire. And through all those transformations, Merlin remained. He was the one indispensable figure, the presence that guaranteed the story's connection to mystery and wonder. Later romancers would give him new roles: teacher, counsellor, lover, victim, but they never questioned his necessity. A story about King Arthur without Merlin was almost unthinkable. Geoffrey had created not just a character but a structural requirement, a mythic function that demanded to be filled. The irony is that Geoffrey himself may not have fully understood what he had made. He was a churchman, a scholar, a man of ambitions that were worldly and practical. He wanted patronage. He wanted preferment. He wanted to make his mark on the intellectual life of his age, and he succeeded. But his success came at the cost of his reputation. By the standards of medieval historiography, Geoffrey was a fraud, a fabricator, a man who passed off invention as truth and claimed authorities that did not exist. He would spend centuries in scholarly disgrace, cited only to be denounced, remembered only as a warning against credulity. But by another standard, the standard of the imagination, the standard of what endures, Geoffrey of Monmouth was one of the great creative geniuses of the Middle Ages. He took a collection of fragments and fashioned them into a mythology. He gave a people their hero. He invented Merlin. He built in words the kingdom that Camelot would come to symbolise, a place of justice and wonder, of fellowship and tragedy, of brightness burning against the dark. That none of it was true, in the historian's sense of truth, hardly matters now. What matters is that people believed it, loved it, retold it, elaborated it, made it their own. The real Arthur, if he existed, vanished centuries before Geoffrey wrote. But Geoffrey's Arthur, the king who conquered Rome, whose wizard moved the stones of Stonehenge, whose birth was shrouded in magic and whose death would be shrouded in mystery, that Arthur lives still. Every time we tell a story about Camelot, every time we invoke the Round Table or the sword in the stone, or the Grail shining in the darkness, we are speaking in Geoffrey's language, using the vocabulary he created. History may judge him a liar, but imagination knows better. Geoffrey of Monmouth told the kind of lies that become true. And now the pieces were in place. The tradition existed. Welsh memory, bardic celebration, Nennius's battle list. The transformation was complete. Geoffrey's grand pseudo-history spreading through the courts of Europe like fire through dry timber. The essential figures stood ready. Arthur, the promised king, Merlin, the prophet wizard who would summon him into being. What remained was to tell the story itself, not as chronicle, not as catalogue, but as romance, as tragedy, as the rise and fall of the greatest kingdom that never was. The sword waited in the stone, the boy waited in obscurity, and the kingdom waited to be born. The sword waited in the stone, but which sword, and in what stone? Here we encounter one of the strangest features of the Arthurian legend, a doubling, a confusion, a splitting of a single symbol into two distinct objects with two distinct meanings. For there are in the fullest versions of the story not one but two swords of power, and their stories have become so entangled over the centuries that even careful readers sometimes mistake one for the other. Yet the distinction matters enormously, because each sword is doing something different, answering a different question about what it means to be a king. The first sword is the sword in the stone. It does not appear in Geoffrey of Monmouth. It does not appear in Wace or Layamon or any of the earlier chronicles. It appears for the first time in the work of a French poet named Robert de Boron, writing at the very end of the 12th century, or the beginning of the 13th, roughly 6 decades after Geoffrey completed his Historia. Robert's poem, titled simply Merlin, accomplished something that Geoffrey had not attempted. It told the story of Arthur's rise to power as a drama of divine election, a sacred proof of legitimacy enacted before the wondering eyes of all Britain. The scene Robert created has become one of the most recognisable in all of Western literature. It is Christmas Eve. A great stone has appeared in a churchyard, and some versions say London, others say another city, and embedded in that stone is an anvil, and driven through the anvil is a sword. Around the stone, inscribed in letters of gold, are words of prophecy. Whoever draws this sword from this stone and anvil is the rightful king of all Britain, born to rule by the will of God. The great lords gather. One by one they try. One by one they fail. The sword does not move. It might as well be part of the stone itself, welded there by forces beyond human strength. Days pass. Weeks. The tournament that was called to celebrate the season continues, and a young squire named Arthur, serving his foster brother Kay, finds himself in need of a sword. Kay has forgotten his own. Arthur runs back toward their lodgings, but he passes the churchyard, and he sees the sword gleaming in the winter light, and he thinks, there's a sword. No one is guarding it. He'll borrow it, bring it to Kay, return it later. He grasps the hilt. He pulls. The sword slides free as smoothly as if it had been resting in oiled leather. What happens next varies in the telling, but the essence is always the same. The miracle is witnessed, the prophecy is confirmed, the boy no one suspected is revealed as the true heir to Uther Pendragon, the once and future king of Britain. The sword in the stone is a proof, not of strength, not of prowess, but of blood and divine favour. Arthur does not win his throne. He inherits it. He is chosen not by the acclaim of warriors or the machinations of politics, but by the will of heaven itself, made manifest in cold iron and ancient stone. This is a profoundly medieval concept of kingship. The 12th and 13th centuries were obsessed with legitimacy, with proving that power was not merely seized but sanctioned, that the man who wore the crown did so by rights that transcended mere force. The great dynasties of Europe claimed descent from ancient heroes, from Trojan princes, from biblical patriarchs, from anyone whose authority came from something older and higher than the chaos of the present. The sword in the stone offered Arthur the ultimate pedigree. God himself had chosen him. The stone was his genealogical record, the anvil his certificate of authenticity, the sword his diploma from the University of Divine Providence. Robert de Boron understood what he was creating. In his poem, the sword is explicitly a symbol of justice, the instrument by which kings render judgment, separate right from wrong, defend the innocent and punish the guilty. Arthur's ability to draw it from the anvil is not a feat of muscle, but a sign of moral fitness. God approves of this boy. God has been watching, waiting, preparing this moment since before Arthur's birth. Merlin knew it. The stone proclaimed it. The sword confirmed it. All that remained was for the world to accept what heaven had already decided. But there is another sword, and here is where the confusion begins. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing more than half a century before Robert de Boron, had already given Arthur a famous weapon. He called it Caliburn, Caliburnus in the Latin, and he said it had been forged on the Isle of Avalon. In Geoffrey's telling, there is no stone, no anvil, no Christmas miracle. Caliburn is simply Arthur's sword, the blade he carries into battle against the Saxons, against the Romans, against all the enemies of Britain. Geoffrey describes its brightness, its deadliness, the way Arthur wielded it to cut down his foes by the hundreds. Caliburn is a weapon of war, not a symbol of succession. When the French romancers took up the Arthurian material, they adapted Geoffrey's Caliburn into their own language. Excalibur, they called it, a name that may derive from the Latin or may have other more mysterious origins. The etymology is debated. One tradition, preserved in later texts, glosses Excalibur as meaning cut steel, suggesting a blade of preternatural sharpness. But whatever the name meant, the sword itself underwent a transformation. In the hands of the Romance writers, Excalibur acquired a new origin story, one that had nothing to do with stones or anvils. In this telling, Arthur receives Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. The scene is haunting. Arthur, newly crowned but not yet tested, follows Merlin to the shore of a still, dark lake. The waters are calm, nothing moves, and then, rising from the centre of the lake, an arm appears, a woman's arm, clothed in white silk, holding aloft a sword of surpassing beauty. A boat waits by the shore. Arthur rows out to the arm, takes the sword, and the arm descends again into the depths. Merlin tells him the sword is called Excalibur, and that its scabbard is even more precious than the blade itself. Whoever wears that scabbard cannot bleed from any wound. Arthur has been given not just a weapon but a talisman, a magical protection against death. This is a different kind of sword altogether. The sword in the stone proves who Arthur is. Excalibur proves what Arthur can do. One is about legitimacy, the other about power. One answers the question of succession, who has the right to rule, while the other answers the question of survival. How can the king prevail against his enemies? The stone sword is a sacrament. Excalibur is an arsenal. And the Lady of the Lake, that mysterious figure rising from the waters, introduces an element that Robert de Braun's Christmas Miracle does not contain. The supernatural feminine, the chthonic power of water and depth and ancient magic that exists outside the church, outside the court, outside the world of men altogether. The stone in the churchyard is a Christian symbol, legible to any cleric, sanctified by its setting. The lake is something older. The arm emerging from its surface recalls the votive offerings that Celtic peoples cast into sacred waters for centuries before Rome, before Christianity, before history. Swords have been dredged from lakes and rivers across Britain and Ireland, offerings to gods whose names are forgotten. The Lady of the Lake may wear white silk and speak courtly French, but she remembers older things. Now, here is where the tangle becomes truly complex. Some texts treat the two swords as the same weapon. The prose Merlin, expanding Robert de Braun's verse original, sometimes calls the sword in the stone Excalibur, collapsing the distinction entirely. If they are the same sword, then Arthur draws Excalibur from the stone, and the Lady of the Lake either does not appear or plays some other role. Perhaps she repairs the sword after it breaks. Perhaps she provides only the scabbard. This version simplifies the narrative at the cost of symbolic richness. There is only one sword of power, and it serves all purposes. But other texts, notably the post-Vulgate Suite du Merlin and following it, Sir Thomas Malory's great 15th century compilation, insist on the distinction. The sword in the stone is one weapon, Excalibur is another. In Malory's telling, the stone sword eventually breaks in combat, and it is only then that Merlin brings Arthur to the lake to receive its superior replacement. This version preserves both origin stories, both symbolic functions, both kinds of power. Arthur is first proven legitimate by the miracle of the stone. He's then equipped for war by the gift of the lake. Divine election and supernatural armament, chrism and cold iron, the church's blessing and the old god's favour. The fact that medieval audiences tolerated, even embraced, this doubling tells us something important about how they understood their own mythology. They were not troubled by contradiction. They did not demand that every detail be reconciled into a single coherent system. What mattered was that Arthur possessed both kinds of authority, the right to rule and the power to rule. The two swords were not a problem to be solved, but a richness to be savoured. Each added something to the portrait of kingship. Each answered a question that the other left open, and both swords served the purposes of the men who patronised these stories. The Angevin court, the dynasty founded by Henry II of England, who ruled from 1154 to 1199, was acutely conscious of its need for legitimising mythology. The Angevins were parvenus, their claim to the English throne resting on a civil war and a contested succession. Henry's mother, the Empress Matilda, had fought for years against Stephen of Blois. Henry himself had prevailed only because Stephen's son died young. The Angevins held England, but they also held vast territories in France: Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, more. They needed a mythology that could bind these disparate lands together, that could make their rule seem inevitable rather than accidental, destined rather than seized. Arthur was perfect for this purpose. Here was a British king who had conquered the Saxons, ancestors of those old Anglo-Saxon dynasties the Angevins had displaced. Here was a king who had ruled over an empire stretching from Scotland to Gaul, who had humbled the pride of Rome itself. Here was a king who had received his throne by divine miracle and his sword from the waters of mystical Britain. If the Angevins were Arthur's heirs, if they could somehow connect themselves to this tradition of sacred kingship and continental dominion, then their rule was not an accident of war but a restoration, a return to ancient glory. The Angevin court devoured Arthurian material. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's queen, was herself a patron of poets and romancers. Her daughter, Mary of Champagne, would commission Chrétien de Troyes to write his great Arthurian romances. The legend grew because it was useful to kings who needed myths, useful to courts that craved entertainment, useful to a culture that was learning to see itself through the mirror of an invented past. The sword in the stone was not just Arthur's legitimation, it was, by implication, the legitimation of any king who could claim Arthur's mantle. And so the two swords, distinct or identical, stone-born or late-given, passed into the permanent vocabulary of the legend. Later writers would elaborate their properties, describe their decorations, enumerate their names in various languages. The sword in the stone would acquire its own rituals, the annual gatherings where pretenders tried and failed to draw it, the mounting frustration of the great lords, the repeated miracle each time Arthur proved his worth anew. Excalibur would gain its magical scabbard, its fatal loss when Morgan le Fay stole it and gave it to Arthur's enemies, its final return to the lake when a dying king ordered his last knight to cast it back into the waters from which it came. Two swords, two stories, two ways of answering the question: what makes a king? The answer the Middle Ages gave was everything: blood and divine favour, magical protection and military might, the blessing of the church and the power of the old waters. Arthur needed both swords because he needed every kind of authority. And when either failed him, when the stone sword broke, when the scabbard was stolen, his kingdom trembled on the brink of disaster. The swords were not merely weapons, they were the visible signs of a kingship that united all sources of legitimacy, that gathered all powers into a single hand, that made the man who wielded them the axis of the world. Without them, Arthur was just another warlord. With them, he was the once and future king. The sword waited in the stone, and the city waited in the poet's imagination, a city that had never existed, that never would exist, that would nevertheless become the most famous court in all of literature. Its name was Camelot. But where did Camelot come from? The answer is remarkably precise. From a single, almost casual reference in a French poem written around 1177, Chrétien de Troyes, the master poet of the Champagne court, working under the patronage of Marie of Champagne, that same daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, composed a romance about Lancelot, the knight of the cart. We will have more to say about Lancelot and his devastating love affair with Queen Guinevere in due course. For now, what matters is the setting. In Chrétien's poem, called Lancelot or Le Chevalier de la Charrette, he mentions in passing that King Arthur held a very magnificent court at Camelot, as was fitting on such a day. Ascension Day, a high feast of the church, that is all. No description of the city, no account of its location, its architecture, its history, just a name, Camelot. It is not in Geoffrey of Monmouth, it is not in Wace, it is not in the Welsh sources, the Latin chronicles, the bardic traditions that remembered Arthur for centuries before Chrétien wrote. Camelot appears fully formed in that single line, as if Chrétien expected his audience to know what he was talking about, or perhaps as if he trusted them not to ask too many questions. Where did the name come from? Scholars have proposed several possibilities. The most frequently cited derives Camelot from Camulodunum, the Latin name for the fortress at modern Colchester, one of the oldest Roman settlements in Britain, its name preserving the Celtic root camulon, meaning crooked, or perhaps the name of a war god. The theory suggests that Chrétien or his sources remembered dimly that there had once been a great Roman-British city whose name began with those sounds, and applied it to Arthur's court. The connection would have been prestigious. Camalodunum was ancient, Roman, civilized. Its name on Arthur's city would have lent the whiff of classical authority. Other candidates have been proposed. Cadbury Castle in Somerset is a massive Iron Age hill fort that was refortified in the late 5th or 6th century, precisely the period when a historical Arthur might have lived. Local tradition long identified it with Camelot, and archaeologists have found evidence of a substantial post-Roman occupation, including a great hall that could have housed a warlord's retinue. But the connection to the name Camelot is purely speculative. Cadbury was not called Camelot in any medieval source. Some have suggested Carlisle, the Roman Luguvalium, which appears in certain Welsh and English texts as Arthur's seat of power. Carlisle is in the north, in the borderlands where Romano-British culture persisted, and where some traditions placed the historical Arthur. But again, the linguistic connection to Camelot is strained. The truth is that no one knows where Chrétien found the name, or whether it referred to any real place at all. Perhaps it was pure invention, a sound that pleased the ear, a word that felt appropriately ancient and mysterious. Chrétien was not writing history. He was writing romance, and romance required a setting of suitable magnificence. Camelot provided that setting, a name that evoked castles and grandeur and the vanished splendour of a legendary past. What matters is what Camelot became. In Chrétien's brief mention, it is already very magnificent, a court where the king holds high feasts on holy days. Later writers would elaborate enormously. The prose cycles of the 13th century would describe Camelot's towers and halls, its tapestries and treasures, its gardens and its great gates. They would populate it with knights and ladies, servants and squires, all the machinery of a functioning court. They would make it the centre of the Arthurian world, the place from which knights departed on their quests, and to which they returned to tell their tales. Camelot became more than a city. It became an ideal, a vision of what a perfect court, a perfect kingdom, a perfect civilization might look like, and central to that vision, as early as Wace's Roman de Brute in 1155, was the Round Table. Wace, translating and expanding Geoffrey of Monmouth into French verse, introduced this element without fanfare, as if it were already well known, though no earlier source mentions it. Arthur, Wace explained, had a table built in the shape of a circle, so that when his knights sat down to feast, none could claim precedence over any other. There was no head of the table, no position of honour from which one might look down on those seated below the salt. All places were equal, all knights were peers. This was not merely a piece of furniture, it was a solution to a problem that anyone familiar with medieval aristocratic culture would have recognised instantly. Warrior societies are obsessed with precedence. Who sits where, who enters first, who receives the best portion of meat, who is addressed with what titles. These were not trivial matters, but questions of honour, and honour was the currency in which reputations were denominated and feuds were begun. Men killed each other over precedence. They insulted each other, drew swords on each other, nursed grudges for generations. The great hall of a king was a minefield of protocol, every seating arrangement a potential provocation. The Round Table diffused this danger. If all seats were equal, then no knight could claim to be preferred above another. The table enforced a fiction, for of course some knights were greater than others, some deeds more glorious, some warriors more renowned, but it was a useful fiction, a social technology that allowed proud men to dine together without blood being spilled. Wace understood this explicitly. He wrote that Arthur made the table round on account of his noble barons, each of whom believed himself to be the best, and none of whom would have tolerated sitting below another. The table was a geometry of diplomacy, but it was also something more. The round shape suggested other meanings: wholeness, completion, the celestial sphere, the turning world. Later writers would connect the Round Table to the table of the Last Supper, where Christ had sat with his disciples in a fellowship that prefigured the fellowship of the Grail Knights. The table became a symbol of Camelot's aspiration, a community of equals, bound by shared honour and mutual loyalty, dedicated to justice and the protection of the weak. It was utopia in wood and stone, and utopias, as every storyteller knows, exist to be destroyed. The perfection of Camelot was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a narrative requirement. A kingdom that is already flawed cannot fall, it can only continue to decline, which is not a tragedy but a chronicle of decay. but a kingdom that is genuinely good, genuinely noble, genuinely the best that human beings can achieve. When such a kingdom falls, the audience feels the loss in their bones. The higher the ideal, the more devastating its destruction. Camelot had to be perfect so that its ruin would mean something. This, then, is what Chrétien and his successors built. Not merely a setting, but a stakes-raising device, a standard against which all failure would be measured. The knights who rode out from Camelot rode out from the best place in the world. When they returned broken, when they betrayed their oaths, when they loved where they should not love and killed whom they should not kill, they were not merely failing themselves, they were failing Camelot. They were proving that even perfection cannot protect against human weakness. The city that was never built became the city that could never stand. Its very glory was its vulnerability. And the men who sat at the round table, those paragons of chivalric virtue, were each carrying within them the seeds of the kingdom's destruction. Let us meet them. The most famous is Lancelot du Lac, Lancelot of the Lake, though he is, paradoxically, a latecomer to the legend. He does not appear in Geoffrey of Monmouth. He does not appear in the Welsh sources. He is, as far as we can tell, the invention of Chrétien de Troyes, who introduced him in that same Lancelot romance where Camelot first received its name. The character was so immediately popular that he quickly became the central figure of Arthurian romance, overshadowing even the king himself. Chrétien tells us Lancelot's backstory only in hints. It was the prose cycles of the 13th century that elaborated his history in full. He was born Galad, yes, the same name that would later be given to his son, the child of King Ban of Benoic, a kingdom somewhere in France. When Ban died, the infant Lancelot was taken by a mysterious woman, the Lady of the Lake herself, and raised in her underwater realm. She taught him the arts of knighthood, the graces of courtesy, the ideals of chivalric love. When he came of age, she sent him to Arthur's court, the most perfect knight in the world seeking the most perfect court in the world. He embodied the rules of courtly love that governed the aristocratic culture of Chrétien's patrons. Courtly love, amour courtois, as later scholars would name it, was a complex code of behaviour governing relations between noble men and women. It demanded that the lover serve his lady with absolute devotion, that he perform great deeds in her honour, that he suffer in her absence and rejoice in her presence, that he keep his love secret from all but her. The love was usually adulterous. The lady was typically married to another man, but this was not considered an obstacle. Indeed, the impossibility of consummation was part of the point. Courtly love was meant to refine the soul, to elevate the lover beyond mere physical desire into a state of exalted devotion. Lancelot loved Guinevere, the queen, Arthur's wife. This was the love that would define his character and ultimately destroy the fellowship of the Round Table. But that destruction lay in the future. For now, in the high noon of Camelot's glory, Lancelot was simply the greatest knight in the world, the most skilled in arms, the most courteous in manner, the most devoted in love, the most admired by his peers. He won every tournament, he conquered every foe, he rescued the queen from 100 dangers. He was, in every external measure, the paragon. But he carried within him a flaw that would prove fatal. Not a flaw of character exactly, but a contradiction at the heart of the chivalric ideal itself. He was supposed to be pure. The greatest knight should also be the most virtuous, the most spiritual, the one closest to God. Yet his love for Guinevere was a sin, adultery, betrayal of his king, violation of his oath of fealty. He could not be both the perfect lover and the perfect knight. The two ideals were incompatible, and when, in time, the Grail appeared and demanded perfect purity of those who would achieve it, Lancelot would find himself barred from the highest quest. His love had rendered him impure. His greatest virtue was also his disqualification. Then there was Gawain, who had been Arthur's chief knight long before Lancelot appeared. In the earliest Welsh sources he is Gwalchmai, the Hawk of May, a warrior of legendary prowess whose exploits are mentioned alongside Arthur's own. In Geoffrey of Monmouth, he is Arthur's nephew and one of his most trusted warriors. In the early romances, he is the model against whom all other knights are measured, the standard of chivalric excellence. But as Lancelot rose, Gawain fell. The French romancers, particularly those who wrote the vast prose cycles of the 13th century, demoted him from paragon to supporting character, from model knight to flawed warrior. In the Vulgate cycle's Questa del Saint Graal, Gawain fails the Grail quest entirely, not because he lacks courage or prowess, but because he lacks spiritual depth. He cannot perceive the Grail's true meaning. He sees only a physical object where the pure of heart see the vessel of Christ's blood, the ultimate mystery of salvation. Gawain is too worldly, too concerned with earthly honour, too embedded in the culture of violence and vengeance to transcend it. Some romances preserved an older, stranger detail about Gawain. His strength waxed and waned with the sun, reaching its peak at noon and declining toward evening. This peculiar trait may be a survival from Celtic mythology, a hint that Gawain was once a solar deity, a god of light whose power followed the arc of his heavenly body. If so, his decline in the literary tradition takes on an additional resonance. The old gods fading before the new, the pagan hero diminished by the Christian Grail. Other knights filled the Round Table. Percival, the innocent fool who would become one of the Grail's achievers, raised in ignorance of chivalry by a mother desperate to protect him from the violent world that had killed his father and brothers. Tristan, whose tragic love for Iseult mirrors and anticipates Lancelot's love for Guinevere. Another knight undone by passion, another story of devotion that transgresses every boundary of law and loyalty. Gareth, Gawain's brother, whose rise from kitchen knave to proven knight demonstrated that true nobility reveals itself through deeds rather than birth. And Galahad, who had not yet been invented when the earliest romances were written, but who would emerge in the Vulgate cycle as the solution to Lancelot's problem, the perfect knight who could achieve what his father could not, the virgin hero unstained by earthly love, the one who would sit in the siege perilous and live. Each of these knights embodied a thesis about virtue. Each represented something the High Middle Ages believed was necessary for a perfect warrior society. Prowess, courtesy, loyalty, purity, innocence, suffering, sacrifice. Together, they composed a portrait of what the age imagined knighthood could be. Not as it actually was, God knows, but as it might be, as it should be, as the romancers wanted their patrons to believe it once had been in the golden age of Camelot. And each knight carried within him the seed of a particular failure. Lancelot's love made him impure, Gawain's worldliness blinded him to the spirit. Percival's innocence made him slow to understand, Tristan's passion drove him to betrayal. The fellowship was composed of virtues in tension, ideals that could not all be realized in a single life. To be the perfect lover was to be an imperfect Christian. To be the fiercest warrior was to be marked by violence. To be innocent was to be ignorant. To be pure was to be untested. The Round Table was not merely a gathering of heroes. It was a constellation of contradictions, a system under stress, a bomb with a slow-burning fuse. The men who sat there loved each other. Lancelot and Gawain were sworn brothers. Gareth worshipped Lancelot as his patron and model, but they would also, in the end, destroy each other. The fellowship would shatter along fault lines that were present from the beginning, cracks that ran through the very definition of what a knight should be. Camelot's perfection was its doom. The Round Table's equality was its fragility. The knight's virtues were their vulnerabilities, and the audience, medieval and modern alike, who loved these stories knew from the beginning how they would end. The fall was coming. The betrayals were coming. Mordred was coming, and the siege of Camlan, and the last battle in which the flower of British chivalry would perish in a single ruinous day. But first, there would be glory. First, there would be quests and adventures, marvels and miracles, loves that burned like fire and loyalties that held like iron. First, there would be the search for something that would justify it all, a sacred object, a divine mystery, a cup that held the blood of God himself. The Grail was waiting, and the Knights of the Round Table, in all their flawed and fatal splendour, were riding out to find it. But before they could seek the divine, they would be tested by the human, and the test that would prove most terrible, more terrible even than dragons or enchantments, or the perils of the wastelands, was the test of the heart. The love between Lancelot and Guinevere is the central tragedy of the Arthurian cycle, the wound that would not heal, the sin that could not be confessed, the open secret that everyone knew and no one could speak. It is also, paradoxically, the great romance of the tradition, the love story that medieval audiences demanded, that poets elaborated with evident relish, that generations of readers have found irresistible even as they recognized its catastrophic consequences. To understand how adultery became heroic, how betrayal became devotion, how the destruction of Camelot became a love story, we must return to the courts of the 12th century and the strange, beautiful, morally bewildering ideology that the troubadours called Fenimore. Chrétien de Troyes composed his Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, sometime between 1176 and 1181, working at the request of Marie de Champagne. Marie was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine by her first husband, Louis VII of France, which made her half-sister to the young princes who had become Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. She was one of the great literary patrons of her age, and her court at Troyes was a centre of poetic innovation. It was Marie, Chrétien tells us in his prologue, who gave him the matière and the scène of his tale, the matter and the meaning, the story and its interpretation. Whatever Chrétien himself thought of the material, he was working to commission. He was giving the Countess what she wanted, and what Marie wanted was a story about love that transcended law. This was the earliest known text to feature Lancelot as a prominent character. Before Chrétien, Lancelot was nobody, a name perhaps, a figure in lists of Arthur's knights, but without story, without personality, without the passion that would define him. Chrétien invented him, or more precisely, Chrétien invented what Lancelot meant, and what Lancelot meant was total devotion, absolute submission, love as a force that overrides honour, reason, self-preservation, and every other consideration that a rational person or a loyal vassal might hold dear. The plot of The Knight of the Cart is deceptively simple. Guinevere is abducted by Melagant, a prince of a mysterious realm from which no stranger returns. Lancelot pursues. Along the way, he encounters a dwarf driving a cart, the kind of cart used to transport criminals to execution, a vehicle of ultimate shame, the medieval equivalent of being paraded in chains. The dwarf offers Lancelot a ride toward the Queen. To accept is to suffer indelible dishonour. To refuse is to delay in his pursuit of his lady. Lancelot hesitates. For 2 steps of a horse's pace, he hesitates. Then he climbs into the cart. This moment is the moral centre of the romance. 2 steps of hesitation. Not a refusal, not a lengthy deliberation, merely a flicker of reluctance before absolute obedience, and Guinevere will later rebuke him for it. When Lancelot finally reaches her, having crossed the sword bridge on bare hands and knees, bleeding from 100 cuts, having fought through every obstacle the hostile realm could throw at him, Guinevere turns coldly away. She refuses to speak to him. She will not acknowledge his sacrifice. Because he hesitated. Because for 2 steps, 2 heartbeats, he considered his own honour before her command. This is Fenimore in its most radical form. The lover exists to serve the beloved. His will is annihilated in hers. His honour means nothing except as she defines it. The social world, with its codes of status, its hierarchies of respect, its elaborate structures of reputation, becomes irrelevant before the single imperative of devotion. Lancelot rode in a convict cart. He became, in the eyes of everyone who saw him, a condemned man, a criminal, a thing of shame. And this was correct. This was what love demanded. His 2 steps of hesitation were a moral failure so severe that the Queen could righteously punish him with cold silence. The paradox was structural and inescapable. The very code of knighthood that made Lancelot admirable, his prowess, his courtesy, his loyalty to his lord, was exactly what Fenimore demanded he sacrifice. A knight's honour was his most precious possession, the foundation of his identity, the thing that made him worth loving in the first place, and Guinevere required him to destroy it. To be worthy of her love, he had to become unworthy of respect. To serve the Queen, he had to betray the king. The erotic economy of courtly love was built on impossibility, on a demand that could never be fully met because meeting it destroyed the very qualities that had attracted the beloved's attention. And Guinevere was no passive prize. This is crucial to understanding the medieval conception. She was the queen, she commanded. When Lancelot fought in a tournament, Guinevere sent word that he should fight badly, that he should shame himself, lose deliberately, appear a coward before the assembled knights. And Lancelot obeyed. He let himself be struck. He fled from inferior opponents. He made himself ridiculous, because she had ordered it, because her will was his law. Only then, having proven his absolute submission, was he permitted to fight well. She sent a second message, "Now do your best." and Lancelot transformed, became again the greatest knight in the world, demolished his opponents with the same arms that had moments before fumbled and failed. The performance was a demonstration of power, not his power, but hers. She could make him weak or strong at will. She could make him shameful or glorious. His identity was her creation. Chrétien did not finish the poem. He handed the completion to another writer, Godefroy de Lagny, claiming that Marie had given him permission to do so. Whether this reflects loss of interest, disagreement with his patroness about the direction of the story, or simple pressure of other work, we cannot know. But the poem as it stands, even unfinished by its original author, established the template that would dominate Arthurian literature for centuries. Lancelot loved Guinevere. Guinevere commanded Lancelot. And Arthur, the great king, the head of the Round Table, the sovereign to whom every knight had sworn loyalty, became an impossible figure, a man cuckolded in plain sight by his best knight and his own wife. What could Arthur do? This was the question that medieval romancers confronted again and again, and their answers reveal the fundamental instability of the narrative structure they had inherited. If Arthur knew about the affair and did nothing, he was a weak king, unmanned by his wife's betrayal, complicit in his own dishonour. If he acted against Lancelot and Guinevere, he would destroy the fellowship, exile or execute his greatest champion, condemn his queen to burning, tear apart the brotherhood of the Round Table. Either choice was fatal, either choice meant the end of Camelot. The Lancelot Grail cycle, composed over roughly 2 decades beginning around 1210 and reaching its fully developed form by about 1235, elaborated this dilemma across thousands of pages. This was the Vulgate cycle, the great prose compilation that would become the standard version of the Arthurian story for the later Middle Ages. It was probably the work of several authors, though medieval tradition attributed it to Walter Map, the same Walter Map whom Geoffrey of Monmouth had cited as the source of his Historia, an attribution equally fictional in both cases. The actual writers appear to have been Cistercian monks, men trained in theology and attentive to questions of sin and redemption, grace and damnation. The cycle retold Arthur's entire history, from the mysteries of Merlin and the begetting of the king through the glories of Camelot to the final catastrophe. But its emotional centre was always the love triangle. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair was tracked across years of narrative time, through separations and reunions, quarrels and reconciliations, moments of renunciation that never lasted, and returns to sin that felt inevitable. The monks who wrote these passages, if monks they truly were, lingered over the details with a fascination that suggests something more than moral instruction. They understood, these anonymous Cistercians, what made the story compelling. They knew their audience wanted to see Lancelot in Guinevere's chamber, wanted to feel the terror of near discovery, wanted to experience the vertigo of forbidden passion. And yet the theological framework was always present, shaping the narrative toward its necessary conclusion. Adultery was a mortal sin. The medieval church was unambiguous on this point. Lancelot and Guinevere were damning themselves with every encounter, moving towards spiritual destruction even as they achieved the heights of earthly love. The Vulgate authors never let their audience forget this. The bliss was shadowed. The passion carried its own punishment. Every kiss was a step toward damnation. Arthur himself became an increasingly tragic figure in this telling. He loved Lancelot, genuinely, deeply, as the son he might have had, as the exemplar of everything he had built the Round Table to produce. He loved Guinevere, his queen, his partner, the woman who had stood beside him through decades of a reign, and he could not have both. To have one, he must lose the other. To keep his honour, he must destroy his heart. The king who had united Britain, who had brought peace after generations of chaos, who had created the most perfect court the world had ever seen, was being slowly crushed between the two people he loved most. This is what courtly love did to Camelot. It introduced a principle of devotion that competed with and ultimately overrode feudal loyalty. A knight was supposed to serve his lord above all others. That was the foundation of the social order, the glue that held the military aristocracy together. But Finnemore demanded that a knight serve his lady above all others. When the lady was the lord's wife, the contradiction became lethal. The vassal's body belonged to his king, his heart belonged to his queen. Sooner or later those claims would collide, and the claims were colliding throughout the narrative, not in a single catastrophic revelation, but in a slow accumulation of tension, missed opportunities for resolution, moments when confession or separation might have averted disaster, always followed by a return to the affair, a reaffirmation of the love that was killing them all. The Vulgate cycle treated this as tragic, genuinely tragic in the Aristotelian sense, a fall brought about not by villainy but by noble qualities carried to their destructive extreme. Lancelot was not wicked, he was devoted. Guinevere was not cruel, she was passionate. Their love was real and deep and in some ways admirable, which was exactly why it was so dangerous. Medieval audiences knew how this would end. The fall of Camelot was not a surprise, it was a destination toward which every page travelled. But the journey was the thing, the elaboration of impossible love, the anatomizing of desire, the exploration of a passion that could not be satisfied and could not be renounced. This was what the Romance audience craved. They read or listened to these stories not to discover what happened, but to experience how it felt, to inhabit for a few hours the consciousness of lovers caught in a beautiful trap, to know what it was like to want something utterly even as they understood that having it would destroy everything they cherished. Guinevere, in the Vulgate tradition, became something more than a symbol or a prize. She emerged as a person, complicated and powerful, whose choices had political weight. She maintained authority over both king and champion, holding the kingdom in balance by the sheer force of her position. As queen, she was the court's centre. Arthur ruled, but Guinevere presided. She was the one whose favour knights sought, whose smile conferred status, whose displeasure could ruin careers. She was not merely the passive object of Lancelot's devotion, but an agent in her own right, making decisions, taking risks, wielding the power that her position afforded her. This made her culpable in ways that a mere victim could not be. She chose Lancelot. She continued choosing him year after year, fully aware of the consequences. She was not seduced, she was a participant. The medieval romancers showed her wrestling with this, suffering over it, recognizing her sin even as she returned to it. Her tragedy was not that she was weak, but that she was strong enough to know what she was doing and to do it anyway. The court knew. Of course the court knew. The romances make this clear in their treatment of rumour and suspicion, the glances exchanged when Lancelot and Guinevere were seen together, the enemies who watched for any slip that might be used to bring them down. Camelot was not fooled by the lover's discretion. Camelot simply chose not to see. The fellowship held together through a collective act of willful blindness, a tacit agreement that the peace of the realm depended on not speaking certain truths aloud. This was Arthur's impossible position, laid bare. He could not act without destroying himself. To accuse Guinevere was to proclaim his own shame, to announce before the world that the great king could not rule his own household. To move against Lancelot was to break the round table, to tear the fellowship apart, to prove that Camelot's unity had been an illusion. So he maintained the fiction. He accepted what he must have known, buried the knowledge beneath kingly composure, held the fragments together by sheer will while the fault lines deepened. The price was paid in his soul. The Arthur of the Vulgate cycle is a man in slow collapse, increasingly withdrawn, haunted by premonitions of disaster, seeking escape in quests and battles that cannot solve the problem waiting for him at home. He is magnificent and pathetic at once, the greatest king in history undone by a situation he cannot control and choices he cannot make. The tragedy is that he is not wrong. Both courses of action, to accuse or to accept, lead to ruin. The only question is which form the ruin will take. But before that ruin came, before Mordred struck and the final battle was fought, there was one more test, one more quest, one more search for something that might redeem it all, that might transform flawed earthly chivalry into a higher calling, that might give meaning to the suffering and justify the sacrifices. The Grail appeared in Arthur's hall on the Feast of Pentecost, and nothing would ever be the same. Chrétien de Troyes had told the first Grail story. His Percival, or the story of the Grail, composed sometime between 1180 and 1190, introduced the mysterious object that would become medieval literature's most enduring symbol. But Chrétien's Grail was not yet holy. It was not yet Christian. It was simply a Grail. A serving dish, a platter, remarkable mainly for its golden beauty and the unexplained light that seemed to emanate from it. In Chrétien's version, the young knight Percival arrives at a mysterious castle where a wounded king, the Fisher King, receives him as an honoured guest. During the evening's procession, Percival witnesses marvels he does not understand. A bleeding lance is carried past, and then comes a maiden bearing a grail, radiant with light, moving through the hall to some destination Percival cannot see. The procession repeats at every course of the meal, and Percival, who's been taught that excessive questioning is discourteous, says nothing. He does not ask what he sees. He does not inquire about the wounded king or the bleeding lance or the luminous vessel. This silence is his great failure. Had he asked, had he simply said the words, the Fisher King would have been healed, the wasteland restored. But Percival remained mute, and in the morning the castle was empty, the king gone, the opportunity lost. Chrétien's Percival is a story about the failure to ask the right question at the right time, about innocence that becomes culpable through passivity, about the moral requirement to engage with mysteries rather than simply witness them. But Chrétien never explained what the Grail was. He died before completing the poem, leaving the mystery unresolved, the significance unstated. Later writers would offer continuations, each proposing their own interpretation, their own elaboration of the symbols Chrétien had scattered through his unfinished text. The bleeding lance became the spear that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. The wounded king became a figure of sin, incapacitated by his own transgressions, and the Grail became holy. Robert de Boron made the transformation explicit. Writing around 1200, just after Chrétien's death, Robert composed his Joseph d'Arimathie, a work that revolutionized the legend by giving the Grail a history. The vessel that Percival had witnessed was, Robert declared, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. It was the same vessel that Joseph of Arimathea had used to collect the blood flowing from Christ's wounds as he prepared the sacred body for burial. Joseph had brought the Grail to Britain, and there it had remained, hidden, waiting for the knight worthy to achieve it. This was an audacious move, grafting Christian salvation history onto what had been a Celtic wonder tale. Robert connected the Arthurian world directly to the events of the Gospels, making the matter of Britain a continuation of sacred history. The knights who sought the Grail were not merely pursuing an adventure, they were participating in the ongoing drama of redemption. Their quest was a pilgrimage, their trials were spiritual tests. Their success or failure would be determined not by martial prowess but by the state of their souls. The Grail became, in Robert's telling and in the tradition that followed, the most sacred object imaginable. A vessel that had touched Christ's body, that had held divine blood, that had been present at the moment of cosmic transformation, when God died to save humanity. To achieve the Grail was to stand in the presence of the sacred. To be worthy of the Grail was to be in some sense worthy of heaven itself. Not all writers accepted Robert's interpretation. Wolfram von Eschenbach, the great German poet who composed his Parzival in the early 13th century, took a different path. Wolfram's Grail was not a cup, but a stone, a lapsit exilis, a phrase of uncertain meaning that has sparked centuries of scholarly debate. His Grail was guarded by a company of Templar knights, not monks. It was sustained by a dove that descended each Good Friday to renew its power. It was the source of earthly and spiritual nourishment for all who remained in its presence. Wolfram's version was no less mystical, but it was mystical in a different register, blending Christian imagery with what appear to be alchemical and possibly Eastern influences. But it was the Vulgate cycle that would prove most influential, and the Vulgate cycle was unambiguously Christian. The section known as the Quête del Saint Graal, composed probably by Cistercian monks, transformed the Grail quest into an explicitly spiritual odyssey, a journey that tested not strength but sanctity. The old chivalric virtues, prowess, courtesy, loyalty, were revealed as insufficient. What the Grail demanded was something more: purity, humility, renunciation of earthly glory. The greatest knight in arms might fail utterly, while a simple fool might triumph. This was the moment the tradition had been preparing. When the Grail appeared at Camelot, descending upon the round table at Pentecost veiled in white samite, filling the hall with unearthly fragrance, providing each knight with the food he most desired, the fellowship knew immediately that their purpose had changed. This was not another adventure. This was the adventure, the one that all others had been leading toward. Gawain rose first, swearing to seek the Grail for a year and a day, to see it more clearly than he had seen it here. and then night after night joined him, until the entire Round Table had committed itself to the quest. Arthur wept. He wept because he understood what this meant. The quest would scatter his knights across the world. They would ride separately, each seeking their own path to the sacred, no longer gathered in the fellowship that had been his life's achievement. Some would succeed, most would fail, and many would not return at all. The Round Table, which had taken decades to build, would empty in a single morning. The Brotherhood would dissolve, the centre would not hold, the king was right to weep. The Grail quest was the beginning of the end. In the quest, night after night was tested and found wanting. Gawain, the worldly champion, could not grasp the spiritual dimension of the quest. He wandered aimlessly, achieved nothing, killed his fellow knights in pointless combats. Lancelot, the greatest knight who had ever lived, rode into spiritual trial after spiritual trial, and always his love for Guinevere betrayed him. He could not renounce it. He could not purify himself. The very quality that made him supreme among earthly warriors, his absolute devotion, his capacity for total love, was the thing that barred him from spiritual perfection. He had given his heart to a mortal woman. He had no heart left for God. The narrative treatment of Lancelot's failure is extraordinary in its psychological depth. He wants to succeed. He tries to be pure. He confesses his sin, does penance, renounces Guinevere again and again, but he cannot make the renunciation stick. In visions and trials, his inadequacy is shown to him with merciless clarity. He sees the Grail, but dimly. He approaches, but cannot enter. He achieves more than most, more than almost any knight except the chosen few, but more than most is not enough. The Grail demands everything. Lancelot has already given everything to someone else. For this quest, the Vulgate authors introduced a new hero, Galahad. He was Lancelot's son, conceived through enchantment when Lancelot was tricked into believing he lay with Guinevere, but in fact slept with Elaine, daughter of the Grail King. Galahad inherited his father's prowess, but not his father's sin. He was pure because he had never loved. He was perfect because he was, in some sense, inhuman, a figure of allegory more than of character, virtue incarnate rather than a man struggling toward virtue. Galahad sat in the Siege Perilous, the seat at the Round Table that had remained empty because it would destroy any knight unworthy to fill it. He drew the sword from the floating stone, proving himself the destined achiever of the Grail. He entered the Grail castle, asked the healing question, restored the Fisher King, witnessed the sacred mysteries in their fullness, and then he asked to die, because having seen the divine, he could not bear to return to the mundane. His soul ascended visibly to heaven, carried upward by angels, while the Grail and the sacred lance rose with him, leaving the earth forever. The Grail had been achieved, and in the achievement, it was lost. The quest was over. The knights who survived straggled back to Camelot, diminished in numbers, exhausted in body and spirit. The Round Table that had sent out its full complement of heroes received back only a remnant. And those who returned were changed, marked by what they had witnessed or by their failure to witness it, no longer the same men who had ridden out with such hope. This was what the Grail quest did to Camelot. It dispersed the fellowship, revealed the unworthiness of most of its members, and removed from the earthly realm the one object that might have justified the whole chivalric enterprise. After Galahad's achievement, what was left to strive for? The greatest possible victory had been won by someone other than Lancelot, other than Gawain, other than any of the familiar heroes. The Supreme Knight had been a newcomer, a virgin, a figure so pure that he was barely human, and he had died rather than continue living in a world that could no longer satisfy him. The quest was supposed to be the crowning glory of the Round Table. Instead, it was the beginning of its dissolution. The knights who returned were fewer, older, more aware of their failures. The brotherhood that had seemed eternal now felt fragile, reduced, haunted by the empty seats of those who would never return, and the sins that the quest had suspended, the love affair that the great adventure had temporarily paused, would resume with renewed intensity, driving toward the catastrophe that everyone had always known was coming. Arthur's tears at the quest's beginning had been prophetic. He had built something beautiful, and he had watched it ride away to its destruction. The Grail had promised redemption. Instead, it had delivered judgment. The knights were not worthy. The fellowship was not pure. Camelot, for all its glory, was a human institution, built on human failures, sustained by compromises and silences that could not survive the light of the sacred. The Grail was gone now, ascended to heaven with Galahad, never to return. What remained was the wreckage, and the reckoning that approached with every passing day. The love that had waited so long for its opportunity would soon have its moment. The enemies who had watched and plotted would soon make their move. The son of a sin older than Camelot was already sharpening his ambitions. The wasteland was spreading. And the kingdom that had seemed eternal was about to learn just how mortal it had always been. The wasteland. We must speak now of the wasteland, for it is the landscape into which Arthur's kingdom is already descending, though few yet recognise the terrain. The Grail has departed, but the Grail's shadow remains, and that shadow falls across a blighted country ruled by a wounded king, a figure who haunts the margins of every Grail narrative, whose suffering is the unspoken premise of the entire quest. He is called the Fisher King, and his wound is the wound of the world. In the romances, he appears under various names, and Fortus in the German traditions, Pelham or Pels in the French, but his condition is always the same. He has been injured in the thighs, a wound that will not heal, a wound that the medieval audience understood as a wound to his generative power, his capacity to father children, to ensure succession, to guarantee that life will continue beyond his own failing body. He cannot die of his injury, but neither can he live. He lies on his litter in the Grail castle of Corbenic, sustained only by the presence of the sacred vessel, which is carried in procession through his hall each evening, offering him enough grace to survive another day, but never enough to restore him. He passes his hours fishing in the waters near his castle, hence his name, because it is the only activity his broken body can still perform. He's king of a land that reflects his condition: barren fields, empty villages, rivers that no longer flow with fish, orchards that bear no fruit. The crops fail because the king is impotent. The realm withers because its lord is wounded. This is the wasteland, and it will not be healed until someone heals the king. The connection between royal body and national health runs deep in medieval thought, deeper than metaphor. The king is the land. His vitality is its fertility. His wounds are its famines. When Chrétien de Troyes introduced this figure in his unfinished Percival, he was drawing on traditions far older than Christianity. Celtic myths of divine kings who must be ritually perfect, who must be sacrificed or replaced when their bodies fail, whose very existence guarantees the turning of the seasons. The Fisher King is that ancient figure Christianized, his wound now understood as a spiritual condition, his healing now dependent not on sacrifice but on grace, on the asking of a question that will restore the connection between heaven and earth. The question. Everything depends on the question. Who does the Grail serve? Or in some versions, what ails you? A question of compassion, of recognition, of willingness to see another's suffering and respond to it. The Grail procession passes through the hall. The lance that bleeds, the silver carving dishes, the radiant vessel itself. The young knight watches in wonder but says nothing. He has been taught that good knights do not ask too many questions, that courtesy requires restraint, that one should not pry into matters that are not one's concern. And so he remains silent. And in the morning, the castle is empty, the king is gone, and the land outside is blasted and dead, more desolate than it was before. The question was not asked, the chance has been missed, the wound remains. This is Percival's failure in Chrétien's telling, and it is a failure that cuts to the heart of what the Grail quest means. Percival has been raised in ignorance, kept from the world of knights by a mother who lost her husband and older sons to chivalric violence. When he finally encounters knights, he thinks they are angels. When he arrives at Arthur's court, he is a rustic fool who does not know how to behave. His education in knighthood is an education in manners, in combat, in the external forms of courtesy. But no one teaches him what matters most, that courtesy without compassion is merely performance, that manners without discernment are hollow, that seeing suffering and failing to respond to it is the deepest failure of all. Percival's silence in the Grail Castle is not a failure of courage. He is brave enough. It is not a failure of skill. He has already proven himself in combat. It is a failure of the heart, a failure to connect what he sees with what he knows, to recognize that the bleeding lance and the wounded king and the mysterious vessel are all crying out for acknowledgement, for someone to care enough to ask what they mean. He has learned to be a knight. He has not yet learned to be human. and so the land remains waste, and so Percival must wander for years, lost in a spiritual wilderness that mirrors the physical desolation he failed to heal. Chrétien's poem breaks off before Percival can return to the Grail Castle and ask the question. The poet died or abandoned the work, and we are left with the wound still open, the question still unasked. But the continuators who completed Chrétien's story, and the later romancers who retold it, gave Percival his second chance. He returns to Corbenic. He has suffered enough, learned enough, become enough of a true human being. This time, when the procession passes, he speaks. "What ails you, Lord?" And the Fisher King is healed. The wound closes, the waters flow again, the fields green, the curse is lifted. But this is only one vision of redemption, and the Vulgate cycle offers another, incompatible and in some ways more troubling. In the great prose compilations that shaped the legend for later centuries, Percival is displaced from the centre of the Grail story. His place is taken by Galahad, and Galahad's path to the Grail is utterly different. Where Percival fails through ignorance and learns through suffering, Galahad never fails at all. Where Percival must grow into compassion, Galahad is born perfect. Where Percival's achievement redeems the wasteland through human feeling, through the simple act of caring enough to ask, Galahad's achievement transcends the wasteland entirely. He does not heal the world, he leaves it. Galahad enters the Grail Castle not as a questing knight who must prove himself, but as the destined achiever whose worthiness was established before his birth. He is the fulfilment of prophecy, the endpoint of a genealogy that runs back through Lancelot to the Grail Kings themselves. His purity is not earned but given, not achieved but inherent. He sits in the siege perilous because he was made for it. He draws the sword from the stone because it was placed there for him. He asks the question, or in some versions, simply manifests such perfect grace that no question is needed, and the Fisher King is healed, and the sacred mysteries are revealed in their fullness. And then, as we have seen, he asks to die. Having glimpsed the divine, he cannot bear the human. Having touched perfection, he refuses to return to imperfection. The Grail ascends with him, and the world is left behind, unredeemed. This is the theological problem at the heart of the Vulgate vision. Galahad represents one understanding of holiness, the saint who is so purely oriented toward heaven that earth holds no attraction, whose achievement of the sacred is also an abandonment of the profane, whose redemption is personal rather than collective. He heals the Fisher King, yes, but he does not heal the land. He does not stay to rule, to restore, to rebuild. He ascends, and the Grail ascends with him, and the wasteland remains. Not desolate in the same way, perhaps, but empty of the sacred presence that might have transformed it. The Grail is gone. Galahad is gone. What was the point? The German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, writing his own Parzival in the early 13th century, understood this problem. His Grail is not the Christian chalice of the French romances, but a mysterious stone called the lapsit exilis, sustained by a dove that descends from heaven each Good Friday to renew its powers. His Grail knights are not monks but a chivalric order, bound to the Grail and to each other, living in community rather than ascending to heaven. And his Parzival, though he fails on his first visit to the Grail Castle, eventually returns to ask the compassionate question, and is made Grail King himself, not taken up to heaven but installed as ruler, his healing of the Fisher King also his own assumption of responsibility for the sacred. Wolfram's vision is of redemption within the world, grace that transforms earthly existence rather than escaping it. But it was the French vision that prevailed, at least in the Arthurian tradition that flowed from the Vulgate through Malory to the legend we inherit. And that vision left Camelot with nowhere to go. The Grail had offered the Round Table a transcendent purpose, something beyond the endless cycle of tournaments and adventures and courtly love affairs. But the Grail's achievement was also its disappearance. The highest goal had been attained by someone who immediately left the world. The remaining knights were stuck in the aftermath, unable to achieve what Galahad had achieved, unable to pretend that ordinary chivalry was enough after they had glimpsed something infinitely greater. The wasteland, in this sense, is not just the Fisher King's blighted realm, it is Camelot itself after the Grail's departure. The fellowship is diminished, the purpose is gone. The sin that the quest temporarily suspended, Lancelot's love for Guinevere, resumes its destructive course. And the deeper sin, the older sin, the sin that predates even Lancelot's arrival at court, is about to emerge from the shadows where it has waited for decades. The son of Arthur's unknowing incest is ready to claim his inheritance. Mordred is coming. In the Welsh annals, he is simply Medrawd, a name associated with Arthur at the Battle of Camelot in an entry for the year 537. The chronicle does not explain their relationship, does not say whether they fought on the same side or opposite sides, does not even make clear that Arthur was a king or Medrawd a traitor. The strife of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell, that is all. 2 names, 1 battle, mutual destruction. The rest is silence. And into that silence, later writers poured everything they needed Mordred to mean. Geoffrey of Monmouth made him Arthur's nephew, the son of King Lot of Orkney, and thus a legitimate member of the royal kin group. In Geoffrey's telling, Mordred is left as regent when Arthur campaigns against Rome, and he betrays that trust absolutely. He seizes the throne, takes Guinevere as his queen, allies with the Saxons whom Arthur had spent his reign defeating. He is a traitor, certainly, but a political traitor, motivated by ambition rather than by anything more personal. Geoffrey's Mordred is an opportunist who seizes chance and takes it. A figure familiar from any number of medieval succession crises, the nephew who decides he should have been the son. But the Vulgate cycle transformed him into something far more terrible. In the great prose compilations, Mordred is revealed to be Arthur's own son, conceived in an act of incest that Arthur did not know was incest at the time. The story runs thus. Before Arthur was crowned, before he had established himself as king, he slept with a woman he did not know was his half-sister. She was Morgause, wife of King Lot, one of the daughters of Igraine by her first husband. Arthur had been raised in secret, ignorant of his true parentage until the moment he drew the sword from the stone. He did not know that Igraine was his mother, he did not know that Igraine's other daughters were his half-sisters, and so, when Morgause came to his court, beautiful and willing, he lay with her without understanding the enormity of what he did. Neither of them knew. That is the tragedy's root. This was not deliberate defiance of divine law, not conscious embrace of forbidden desire. It was ignorance, simple and devastating ignorance. But ignorance does not prevent consequences. Morgause conceived, and the child she bore was Mordred, fruit of a union that violated the deepest taboos of blood and kinship. When Arthur learned what he had done, when prophecy revealed that the child born of his sin would destroy his kingdom, he tried to undo the damage. The Vulgate tells us that he ordered all children born on the day of Mordred's birth to be set adrift on the sea, a Herod-like massacre of innocents meant to prevent the prophecy's fulfillment. But Mordred survived. He always survives. The sin cannot be undone by further sin. The consequences cannot be escaped by compounding the original crime with infanticide. This is the theological architecture of the Vulgate's vision. Arthur's kingdom is built on a concealed fault line, a crack in its foundations that runs all the way back to before its founding. The glory of Camelot, the fellowship of the Round Table, the great adventure of the Grail, all of it rises from soil poisoned by an act that occurred before any of it existed. Arthur did not know what he was doing. Arthur is not morally culpable in the way a deliberate sinner would be. But the sin is real nonetheless, and it demands payment. Mordred is that payment, the son who should never have been born, raised in the shadow of his father's court, watching the glory that he can never truly share because his very existence is a scandal that must be concealed. The Vulgate tells us that Mordred began his career as a good knight. He was brave, skilled, capable of loyalty and valour. He might have been an ornament to the Round Table, a worthy son of Arthur if he had never learned the truth. But he learned it. A hermit told him. In the wilderness, in a chance encounter, the holy man revealed to Mordred the circumstances of his birth, that he was Arthur's son by incest, that he was prophesied to destroy everything his father had built, that his very existence was an abomination in the eyes of God and man. What does such knowledge do to a man? The Vulgate suggests that it breaks something in Mordred that can never be repaired. He had been a good knight. Now he becomes the instrument of fate, embracing the destruction he was born to accomplish, because he has been told that is all he can ever be. The prophecy creates its own fulfillment. Mordred becomes a villain because everyone has always expected him to become a villain, because the narrative demands a villain, and he has been cast in the role since before his birth. He is Arthur's sin made flesh, walking the halls of Camelot as a living reproach, waiting for his moment. Morgan Le Fay walks beside him in the shadows, though her evolution follows a different path. In the earliest sources, she's a healer, one of the 9 sisters who rule the Isle of Avalon, the one who will receive Arthur's wounded body after Camlan and nurse him toward recovery. Geoffrey of Monmouth calls her Morgan and describes her magical powers as benevolent. She can change her shape, she can fly, she has mastered the healing arts. There is nothing sinister about her. She's a figure of Celtic otherworld power, a fairy queen adapted to the margins of the Arthurian narrative. But the French romancers could not leave her there. As the cycle darkened, as the theological weight of sin and consequence pressed more heavily on the story, Morgan was transformed into an adversary. The Vulgate and the texts that followed made her another of Igraine's daughters, another of Arthur's half-sisters, and they gave her a grievance. She loved Lancelot, and Lancelot loved Guinevere, and Morgan's rejected desire curdled into hatred. She became the schemer who tries to reveal the adultery, the enchantress who works against Arthur even as she remains entangled with him by blood. Her healing power became the dark mirror of her destructive intent. She could save Arthur if she chose. She chooses instead to wound him, or to let him be wounded, or to position herself to receive the advantages that his wounding will create. Morgan and Mordred are not always allies in the sources. The medieval tradition is too sprawling and contradictory to present a unified conspiracy, but they are both figures of the wound that Camelot inflicted on itself. Morgan is the sister whose power was never given its proper place. Mordred is the son whose existence was never acknowledged. Together they represent everything the Round Table tried to suppress, every compromise and silence that kept the Fellowship functioning, every buried truth that is now clawing its way to the surface. The catastrophe, when it comes, will not be an accident. It will not be an invasion from outside, not a Saxon onslaught or a Roman imperial reassertion. It will be Camelot dying of its own wounds, the kingdom consuming itself because the sins at its foundation have finally come due. Arthur built something beautiful on poisoned ground. The poison has spread through every root and branch, and now the harvest is upon him. The final unravelling began, as we have seen, with the Grail quest's aftermath. Lancelot had returned from the quest humiliated, confronted with his unworthiness, unable to achieve what his own son had achieved so effortlessly. The restraint that had kept his love for Guinevere within bounds, the public discretion, the willingness to let the affair remain an open secret rather than a declared scandal, that restraint began to fail. Perhaps Lancelot no longer cared about discretion. Perhaps Guinevere demanded more from him than furtive meetings. Perhaps the Fellowship's decline made concealment seem less necessary. Whatever the cause, they grew careless, and eyes that had politely looked away now looked directly at what they had always known. Mordred watched. He watched, and he waited, and he gathered allies among those who resented Lancelot's prominence, among those who had suffered from Arthur's justice, among those who saw opportunity in chaos. The Orkney faction, the sons of Lot, Mordred's brothers or half-brothers depending on which tradition we follow, included men like Agravain, who hated Lancelot for his own reasons and was willing to force the issue that Arthur had so carefully avoided confronting. Together they laid their trap, the ambush at Guinevere's chamber, the knights bursting in to find Lancelot unarmed but unmistakably present where he should not be. The fight in the corridor as Lancelot killed his way to freedom, slaying good knights, Round Table companions, men he had fought beside for years. Agravain fell, others fell. Lancelot escaped to his own castle across the sea, and behind him he left a scandal that could no longer be suppressed. Arthur had no choice now. Custom demanded that an adulterous queen be burned. Law demanded that a proven traitor be punished. The king, who had closed his eyes for so long, was forced to open them, forced to condemn the woman he loved and pursue the knight he loved, forced to choose between his personal attachments and his duty to the throne he occupied. He chose duty, or duty chose him, and Guinevere was led to the stake. Lancelot's rescue tore the Fellowship apart permanently. He rode in with his followers, scattered the guards, cut down the knights who stood between him and the queen, and carried her away to safety. But among the knights he killed were Gareth and Gaheris, brothers of Gawain, men who had loved Lancelot and refused to bear arms against him, even as they stood guard at the queen's execution. They were unarmed, unhelmed, recognisable. Lancelot killed them anyway in the madness of the fight, not seeing who they were until too late. Gawain had been Arthur's nephew, his most loyal supporter, a man who had tried to prevent the confrontation, who had argued for mercy and reconciliation. But Gawain could not forgive the deaths of his brothers. His love for Lancelot transformed into a hatred just as absolute, and he drove Arthur to pursue the war even when Arthur might have preferred peace. The king besieged Lancelot's castle, the kingdom divided. The strength that should have defended Britain against all enemies was instead exhausted in civil war between the two greatest champions the Round Table had ever produced. And while Arthur was abroad pursuing vengeance for a dishonour that had wounded him less than the necessity of acknowledging it, Mordred made his move. He declared Arthur dead. He claimed the throne. He tried to take Guinevere as his wife or his captive, depending on the source. Some traditions say she submitted, others say she fled to a tower and refused him. He allied with the Saxons, those ancestral enemies, promising them the lands that Arthur had won in the 12 battles. He assembled an army of opportunists and traitors, and those who simply saw which way the wind was blowing. He made himself everything that Arthur had spent a lifetime fighting against. Arthur came back. Gawain died on the beach during the landing, mortally wounded in a skirmish before the final battle, though some traditions give him time to reconcile with Lancelot before the end, to forgive his former friend and beg him to come to Arthur's aid. But Lancelot was far away. Lancelot would arrive too late. What came instead was Camlan. Camlan. The name itself is uncertain. Camelford in Cornwall, the River Cam in Somerset, Camboglanna on Hadrian's Wall, the Crooked Bank in whatever location might match the Celtic etymology. The medieval tradition did not know where it was. The medieval tradition knew only that it was everywhere, that it was the place where everything ended, that the name meant only death. The armies faced each other in the grey light of a British morning. Arthur and Mordred met for a parley, and some traditions say they might have reached an agreement, that even then some compromise might have been possible. But an adder slithered in the grass. A knight drew his sword to kill it. The watching armies saw the blade flash and thought it treachery. Someone charged. Everyone charged. And the battle that no one intended became the battle that killed a world. It lasted until nightfall. It lasted until there was no one left to fight. The chronicles struggle to convey the completeness of the destruction. This was not a battle with a winner and a loser, not a contest where one side prevailed and the other fled. This was mutual annihilation. Wace, the Norman poet, wrote, "I neither know who lost nor who gained that day. No man wist the name of overthrower or of overthrown. All alike are forgotten, the victor with him who died. The knights fell. The great names of the Round Table fell. Ywain and Lucan and Bedivere and all the rest, the men who had ridden out on the Grail quest. The survivors who had been too few, and now became fewer still, and then none at all. The flower of British chivalry was cut down in an afternoon. The 1,000 years of storytelling that we have traced through chronicle and romance, through Welsh triads and French prose cycles, through the accretions of centuries, all of it led to this field, to this slaughter, to this end that was so complete, it left almost nothing behind. Layamon, the English poet writing in the early 13th century, counted 3 survivors: Arthur himself and 2 nameless knights. The Welsh tradition, in Culhwch and Olwen, named 3 different survivors: Sandef, so beautiful that the warriors thought him an angel and would not strike him; Morfran, so ugly they thought him a devil and feared to approach; and Sinwyl, who fled on his horse and was the last to leave the field. 3 men out of armies, 3 men out of the thousands who had followed Arthur and the thousands who had followed Mordred. The Round Table had seated 150 knights at the height of its glory. Now there was no one left to sit at it. And in the midst of the corpses, among the dying and the dead, Arthur found Mordred. Or Mordred found Arthur. The sources do not agree on who sought whom, only that they came together at last, father and son, king and usurper, the bright hope of Britain and the dark prophecy of its doom. They fought and they fell together. Mallory gives us the final image. And when Sir Mordred felt that he had his Deith's wound, he thrust himself with the might that he had up to the burr of King Arthur's spear. Even dying, Mordred pushed himself further onto the lance that killed him, driving himself up the shaft until he could reach Arthur with his own sword. He would not die alone, he would take his father with him. The 2 of them fell together on that field of slaughter, united in death as they had been joined in the sin that created them both. Arthur was not dead yet. Arthur would not die for hours, perhaps days. He was mortally wounded. Mordred's final stroke had seen to that, but the life was slow to leave him. He lay on the field as the sun set, as the scavengers began their work on the bodies of the fallen, as the age of Camelot bled out into the grass of Camlan. Sir Bedivere attended him, one of the last survivors, one of the first companions, a knight who had been with Arthur since before the Round Table was founded. And Arthur gave him a final command. Take Excalibur. Take the sword that had been his since the Lady of the Lake first raised it from the waters. Throw it back into the lake from which it came. Return the weapon to its source. Bedivere took the sword. He went to the water's edge, and he could not do it. Twice he hid Excalibur and returned to Arthur claiming he had thrown it, and twice Arthur knew he was lying. What did you see? Nothing but the wind on the water. Then you did not throw it. Go back. The third time Bedivere threw true, and a hand rose from the lake, the hand of the lady, or a hand, or something that had been waiting all this time to reclaim what it had given. The hand caught Excalibur, brandished it 3 times, and drew it down beneath the surface. The sword was gone. The magic that had sustained Arthur's reign was returned to the other world from which it came. Then the barge came. Then the black-draped boat appeared, moving silently across the water, bearing women who wept. Morgan among them, perhaps. Morgan the healer. Morgan the destroyer. Morgan whose role in this final scene returns to its oldest form. They took Arthur aboard. They carried him across the water toward Avalon, toward the Isle of Apples, toward a place of healing that might save him, or a place of death that might receive him. Mallory writes, "Some men say in many parts of England that King Arthur is not dead, but had by the will of our Lord Jesu into another place. And men say that he shall come again, and he shall win the Holy Cross." The legend refused to confirm his death. The legend refused to end. On his tomb, if there was a tomb, they wrote, "Hic ea set Arthurus, rex quondam rexque futurus." Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. The future king, the king who will return. The king who even in this moment of ultimate destruction carries within him the seed of hope, the promise that this ending is not truly an end. That is what waits for us in Avalon, the myth that refuses to die, the king who sleeps rather than lies dead, the promise that when Britain needs him most, he will come again. But that is a tale for our final chapter. For now, let us remain here on the field of Camlan as the darkness falls, among the bodies of the knights and the ruin of the dream, in the silence that follows the extinction of a world. The wasteland has claimed its king, the wound has finally proven fatal, and somewhere across the water, in a place that is neither life nor death, Arthur waits. And in that waiting, the legend begins its longest life. For what happens to a hero after death determines whether he fades into the obscurity of forgotten chieftains or becomes something more, something eternal. Arthur, carried across the water in that black-draped barge, enters a different kind of existence. He passes from the realm of history, where dates and battles and the hard edges of fact constrain what can be said, into the realm of myth, where meaning multiplies with each retelling and death itself becomes negotiable. The isle to which they carried him had a name, Avalon. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing his Historia Regum Britanniae in 1136, first set this name into the written record, describing it as the place where Arthur was taken to have his wounds tended after the catastrophe of Camlan. Geoffrey did not elaborate greatly on Avalon in his Historia. It appears almost in passing, a destination rather than a dwelling place, a hope rather than a certainty. But Geoffrey returned to this mysterious island later, in his Vita Merlini, and there the isle takes fuller shape. Morgan presides over it, he tells us, chief among 9 sisters who rule that enchanted place, skilled beyond measure in the healing arts. The wounded Arthur was placed in her care, in her golden chambers, and Geoffrey allows the possibility, never the certainty, that he might be healed. The word itself carries meaning in its sound. Avalon. The Isle of Apples, some etymologists suggest, from the Welsh Aifalon, a place of orchards and abundance, of fruit that grants immortality in Celtic tradition. Others hear echoes of other mythic isles, the blessed lands that appear throughout the storytelling of peoples who lived at the edge of the Atlantic, those western islands where the sun sets into waters that lead to the other world. The Greeks had their Hesperides with their golden apples, the Irish had Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, and Mag Mell, the plain of joy. The Welsh themselves spoke of Anwefn, the deep place, the realm beneath or beyond, where the cauldron of rebirth could restore the dead to life. Avalon belongs to this archipelago of immortality, this geography of hope that mariners of the imagination have charted since humans first watched the sun sink into the western sea and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. Layamon, writing his Brut at the turn of the 13th century, perhaps around 1190 to 1215, the dates remain uncertain, gave Arthur's departure its most haunting English expression. His poem, composed in alliterative verse that echoed the old rhythms of Anglo-Saxon poetry, even as it told tales derived from French and Latin sources, was the first work of history written in English since the Anglo-Saxon chronicle fell silent. And Layamon imagined Arthur's final words to Constantine, the kinsman who would inherit what remained of the shattered kingdom. "And I will fare to Avalon, to fairest of all maidens, to Argante the queen, elf most beautiful, and she shall make my wounds all sound." Argante. Not Morgan, in Layamon's telling, but Argante, the elf queen, the beautiful, the healer. The name may be a corruption of Morgan, or it may represent an older tradition that Geoffrey did not record, or it may be Layamon's invention, his contribution to the expanding tapestry of the legend. What matters is the note of confidence in Arthur's voice, even in extremity. He does not say he goes to die, he says he goes to be healed, he says he will return. "And afterward I will come again to my kingdom," Arthur tells Constantine in Layamon's version, "and dwell with the Britons with much joy." The Britons believed this, or enough of them believed it, for long enough that the belief itself became part of the legend. The Celtic peoples, the Welsh, the Cornish, the Bretons of Armorica, who had fled across the Channel when the Saxons came, they carried Arthur's memory with them, and in that memory he was not dead. He was sleeping, he was healing, he was waiting. When the need grew great enough, when the Saxon yoke grew too heavy to bear, when the hour of Britain's greatest danger arrived, he would wake, he would rise, he would return with all his knights about him, with Excalibur blazing in his hand, and he would drive the enemies of the Britons into the sea as he had done at Mount Badon all those centuries ago. This is the hope that would not die. This is the refusal of finality that distinguishes Arthur from other fallen heroes. Hector dies before the walls of Troy and does not return. Roland falls at Roncesvalles and the Franks do not expect him to rise again. But Arthur is different. Arthur sleeps in Avalon, or in a cave beneath a mountain, or in some liminal place between life and death, and the Britons watch the horizon, and they remember the prophecy, and they wait. The Normans found this inconvenient. When William the Conqueror's descendants consolidated their hold on England, they inherited not just a kingdom, but a mythology. And parts of that mythology were distinctly uncomfortable for a ruling dynasty whose ancestors had arrived as invaders. The Welsh, pushed into their mountain strongholds, nursed their grievances and their hopes together, and among those hopes was Arthur, the returning king, the once and future king, the king who would drive the foreigners from the land. For the Norman and Angevin monarchs, this was not merely a romantic legend. It was a potential rallying cry for rebellion, so the legend had to be managed. It had to be appropriated, co-opted, turned from a weapon of resistance into a tool of legitimacy. We have already seen how the Angevin court, Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, their sons and daughters, patronised Arthurian romance, how they encouraged the poets to transform Arthur from a Celtic champion into a universal king whose glory reflected upon all who claimed his inheritance. But there was one particularly audacious act of legendary manipulation that deserves our attention, because it attempted something that no amount of poetry could accomplish. It attempted to kill the hope. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey announced an extraordinary discovery. They had found Arthur's grave. Glastonbury, in the Somerset marshes, was already ancient and already sacred. The abbey claimed foundations going back to the earliest years of Christianity in Britain. Some stories said Joseph of Arimathea himself had planted his staff in Glastonbury's soil, where it bloomed into the famous thorn tree. The monks cultivated these traditions, and they cultivated pilgrims, and they cultivated royal attention. In 1184, a devastating fire had destroyed much of the abbey, and the monks faced the expensive prospect of rebuilding. What they needed was a miracle, or failing that, a discovery so extraordinary that pilgrims and patrons would flood in with donations. What they found, they claimed, was Arthur. 7 feet down in the abbey graveyard between 2 stone pyramids whose inscriptions had worn illegible with age, the monks unearthed a massive oak coffin. Inside, they reported, lay bones of heroic scale, a man of great stature, a giant among his contemporaries. With the bones, they found a tress of golden hair that crumbled to dust when a monk reached for it. Guinevere, they said, buried alongside her king. And above the coffin, beneath the covering stone, they found a lead cross inscribed with words that settled the matter beyond dispute. Hic et sepultus inclitus rex Arthurus in insula Avalonia. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. The discovery was announced with great ceremony. The bones were exhumed, examined, venerated. In 1278, King Edward V himself would visit Glastonbury with Queen Eleanor and witness the reinterment of Arthur's remains in a magnificent marble tomb before the high altar. The king who had conquered Wales, who was engaged in the systematic destruction of Welsh independence, stood beside the bones of the Welsh hero and proclaimed the matter settled. Arthur was dead. Arthur was buried. Arthur would not return to lead the Welsh against the English crown. The cross has survived, or at least a drawing of it made by the antiquary William Camden in the 16th century has survived. The cross itself disappeared sometime after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Modern scholars who have examined Camden's drawing and the various accounts of the discovery have reached a near unanimous conclusion. The entire affair was a fraud. The letter forms on the cross do not match those of the early medieval period in which Arthur supposedly lived. They are consistent with 12th century styles. The timing was too convenient, a financially desperate abbey discovering the most lucrative possible relic just when it needed money most. The political benefits were too obvious, a discovery that simultaneously attracted royal patronage and undermined Welsh hopes of a returning king. The association of Glastonbury with Avalon had no basis in earlier tradition. The Isle of Apples should logically be an island, not a monastery in the Somerset levels, however marshy the surrounding landscape. The monks had manufactured Arthur's death. They had produced bones, whose bones we cannot know, perhaps some ancient British chieftain, perhaps a random assortment of large medieval skeletons. And they had attached to those bones a leaden certification of identity. They had transformed the mysterious Isle of Healing into a specific tourist destination. They had replaced hope with a tomb, and it did not work. The legend refused to die. The Welsh continued to nurse their hopes. The poets continued to speak of the sleeping king. However many pilgrims visited Glastonbury to venerate Arthur's bones, more continued to believe that the true Arthur lay elsewhere, in a cave beneath Cadbury Hill perhaps, or under the mountains of Snowdonia, or in some otherworldly Avalon that could not be found on any map because it existed outside ordinary geography, in the space between sleep and waking, between death and resurrection. The Glastonbury tomb was a rival tradition, an alternative ending, but it never replaced the older hope. When people spoke of Arthur, they continued to speak of return. When they wrote Rex quondam rexque futurus, the once and future king, they were acknowledging that the future remained open. This is the paradox at the heart of the Arthurian legend, that it is a story about catastrophic failure, about betrayal and adultery and incest and civil war and the destruction of everything noble, and yet it refuses to end in despair. The Round Table is shattered, the Fellowship is dead, Camelot has fallen to ruin. The kingdom has returned to the chaos and bloodshed from which Arthur briefly raised it. Every human institution that Arthur built has crumbled, and still, the legend insists that this is not truly the end, that Arthur waits, that Arthur will return, that the dream, though broken, persists somewhere beyond the horizon, and in the hour of greatest need it will be made flesh again. What does it mean that we have told this story for 1,000 years? Consider the span of it. When Nennius compiled his Historia Brittonum around 828, scratching Arthur's 12 battles into the historical record with the note that the British chieftain carried the image of the Virgin Mary on his shoulders and slew 960 enemies in a single charge, the Western Roman Empire had been gone for 3.5 centuries. Charlemagne's descendants were dividing his empire among themselves. The Vikings were beginning their raids on the coasts of Britain and Francia. The world Nennius knew would have been unrecognisable to any Roman senator, and yet he reached back through the chaos of the intervening centuries to find Arthur, to claim him, to place him in the narrative of British identity as a fixed point around which memory could organise itself. When Geoffrey of Monmouth transformed those scraps of tradition into his sprawling Historia Regum Britannia in 1136, the Norman conquest was still recent enough that men alive could remember the chaos of the succession crisis that followed it. The civil war between Stephen and Matilda was tearing England apart. Geoffrey's Arthur, the conqueror of Europe, the challenger of Rome, the king who briefly made Britain the centre of the world, spoke to an audience that had witnessed the devastating consequences of weak kingship and wanted to believe in the possibility of strong. Geoffrey's invention became the foundation for everything that followed. As scholars have noted, Arthurian works are categorised as pre-Galfridian and post-Galfridian, depending on whether they reflect his influence. His Historia gave the legend its shape, its scope, its claim to historical significance. Without Geoffrey, Arthur might have remained a figure of Welsh provincial memory. With Geoffrey, Arthur became a figure of European imagination, when the anonymous authors of the Vulgate cycle, likely a group of Cistercian monks working in the early 13th century, expanded and transformed the Arthurian material into the vast prose saga of the Lancelot Grail. They brought to it the theological anxieties of their age. The Fourth Crusade had just sacked Constantinople, Christians slaughtering Christians in an act of inexplicable betrayal. The Albigensian Crusade was burning heretics in southern France. The Church was wrestling with questions of sin and salvation, grace and works, the possibility of perfection in an imperfect world. The Grail quest that the Vulgate authors imagined, with its vision of purity so absolute that only Galahad could achieve it, with its insistence that earthly love, however noble, was finally insufficient, with its removal of the sacred object from the world and its abandonment of Camelot to its fate, spoke to an audience that understood that heaven and earth were not easily reconciled, that human endeavour, however heroic, could not reach divine perfection, that something always falls short. When Sir Thomas Malory gathered the scattered threads of Arthurian tradition and wove them into his Morte d'Arthur, penning those famous words in 1469 in a prison cell while the Wars of the Roses tore England apart around him, he created the version of the legend that has shaped every retelling since. Malory was a knight who had fought on one side or another of the dynastic conflicts that consumed his era. He had seen ideals betrayed, fellowship shattered, noble houses destroyed. His Camelot is bathed in the elegiac light of a world already passing, already lost. His Arthur is tragic not because he is flawed, but because he is not flawed enough. A good king surrounded by forces of destruction that his goodness cannot withstand. Malory's prose has the cadence of elegy, and many men say that there is written upon his tomb this verse, Hic iacet Arthurus, rex quondam rexque futurus. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. Malory allows the hope but dwells in the loss. When Alfred Lord Tennyson returned to Arthur in his Idylls of the King, publishing the sections over decades from 1859 to 1885, he brought Victorian anxieties to the material, the fear of moral decay, the worry that the British Empire at its height contained within it the seeds of its own corruption, the hope that individual virtue might somehow shore up the crumbling institutions of civilization. Tennyson's Arthur is noble to the point of stiffness, his Guinevere a woman destroyed by passion, his Lancelot a study in the tragic gap between capability and character. The Idylls are imperial poems written by a poet laureate who understood that empires fall, that Camelots crumble, that the Round Table is always breaking apart somewhere in the world, in every generation, forever. When T.H. White began publishing The Once and Future King in 1938, with Europe sliding toward catastrophe, with fascism ascendant and another world war looming, he brought to Arthur a question that would haunt the century. What is the use of might? His Arthur, educated by Merlin in the ways of animals and the follies of men, attempts to redirect violence into justice, to transform might into right, to create institutions that can contain human aggression and channel it toward productive ends. White's Arthur invents civilization as an antidote to barbarism, and the tragedy of his story is that barbarism finds a way to corrupt civilization from within. The Second World War proved White's point even as he was writing. The final solution was accomplished by men in offices with files, bureaucratic might deployed with ruthless efficiency. The institutions cannot save us, and yet, we keep building them. This is what the legend says about us, that we cannot stop trying, that we know Camelot will fall, but we build it anyway, that we know the fellowship will shatter, but we gather the knights to the table regardless, that we know the Grail cannot be achieved by ordinary mortals, and yet we send them on the quest, because not to seek perfection is somehow worse than seeking it and failing. The Arthurian cycle endures because it is a story about the gap between human ideals and human nature, and every age finds that gap in itself. We are still telling this story. We have never stopped. Contemporary culture is saturated with Arthurian retellings, reimaginings, adaptations. Films and television series revisit Camelot every few years, each version reflecting its moment, gritty and violent when we're anxious about social collapse, romantic and idealistic when we long for clarity of purpose, feminist and revisionist when we recognise that the old versions silenced voices that deserve to be heard. Young adult novels retell the legend for teenagers discovering for the first time that the world contains betrayal. Literary fiction excavates the psychological depths of Guinevere, of Morgan, of Arthur himself. Video games make players knights of the Round Table, questing through procedurally generated wildernesses for grails of various sorts. The matter of Britain has become the matter of the world, and still the fundamental shape persists. A fellowship gathers around a visionary leader. A quest calls them forth. Love and loyalty conflict, and the conflict destroys what could not be destroyed by any external enemy. The dream dies, and somewhere beyond the western water, the king waits to return. The specific names change. The details shift with fashion and sensibility, but the structure endures because it answers to something permanent in human experience. The knowledge that our highest aspirations are also our greatest vulnerabilities, that the things we love most deeply are the things most capable of destroying us, that there is no fortress strong enough to keep out the enemy who sits beside us at the table. Arthur did not fall to Saxons. Arthur fell to Mordred. Camelot was not sacked by foreign invaders. Camelot was torn apart from within, by the sins of its own founder, by the passions of its greatest knight, by the accumulated weight of compromises and secrets and deferred reckonings that finally came due. This is not a story about defeat by enemies. This is a story about defeat by ourselves, and the hope of return, the Rex Quondam Rexque Futurus, the promise of Avalon. What is that hope except the belief that we are capable of learning, that the next time might be different, that the fellowship might hold, that we might build a Camelot that does not contain its own destruction in its foundations. The legend of Arthur's return is the legend of second chances, of redemption, of the possibility that human beings might someday achieve the ideals that have thus far eluded them. The hour of greatest need, the stories say. When Britain faces its darkest moment, Arthur will wake. He will rise from whatever sleep holds him. He will come again. We have had dark hours since Camelot. If there ever was a Camelot, if there ever was an Arthur, if any of this has any connection to history at all, we have had plagues and conquests, civil wars and world wars, tyrannies and catastrophes of every description. Britain has called for Arthur, and Arthur has not come. The sleeper has not woken. The barge has not returned from Avalon. But the story continues to be told. The prophecy continues to be repeated. Generation after generation we describe the king sleeping in his cavern, surrounded by his knights in their unrusting armour, waiting for the trumpet that will summon them to Britain's final battle. We do not believe it literally, most of us, but we believe it somehow. We want it to be true. We want to think that at the very end, when all seems lost, a hand will rise from the lake with a sword of light, and Arthur will return, and the dream will be made real at last. Perhaps that is what myths are for. Perhaps the literal truth of a story matters less than its function, the work it does in the souls of those who hear it. The Arthurian cycle does the work of reminding us that ideals exist, that fellowship is possible, that there was once, or at least that there could once have been, a king who truly sought justice, knights who truly pursued honour, a table where all sat as equals in service to something larger than themselves. The failure of that ideal does not erase its power. The fall of Camelot does not unmake Camelot. For one shining moment, to borrow the phrase of a later century's telling, the world contained a place where things were as they should be. The historians will continue their work. They will sift the sparse evidence of post-Roman Britain, looking for the historical kernel, the real warlord who might have led Britons against Saxons in the desperate years around 500 CE. Perhaps they will find him. Perhaps they will definitively prove he never existed. It will not matter to the legend. Arthur escaped history a long time ago. He belongs to something older and more permanent, to the human need for stories that contain both our failures and our hopes, for heroes who embody what we wish we were, for endings that are not quite endings. Somewhere, the barge moves slowly across dark water. Morgan tends her brother's wounds. The Isle of Apples waits in a mist that never lifts, and Arthur lies in something like sleep, his hand still reaching for Excalibur, his dreams still full of the Round Table and the Fellowship and the quests and the glory, waiting for the call that will bring him back. Rex quondam rexque futurus, the once and future king. The story that does not end because we will not let it end. The hero who does not die because we need him to be sleeping. The promise that hangs over every age, every generation, every telling, that somewhere beyond the world we know, past the gates of death and the mists of Avalon, the dream persists, that the wound can be healed, that the wasteland can flower, that the king can return. He has not returned yet. But the story is still being told, and while the story is told, the possibility remains